The morning sun illuminated the gardens of the Thompson estate, where hundreds of white flower arrangements decorated the path to the altar. Ethan Thompson, at 32 years old, adjusted his Italian silk tie one last time in front of the mirror. His reflection revealed not only the impeccable designer suit, but also the face of someone who had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of. He was the CEO of one of the largest technology companies in the country, was about to marry Olivia Rothschild, and his fortune only grew. "It's almost time," said Jake, his best friend and best man, entering the room. "The guests are already arriving." Ethan smiled, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed uneasiness. Perhaps it was just the natural nervousness of a groom, but an inner voice insisted on questioning whether Olivia was really the right person. In recent months, since he had taken over the presidency of the company, she seemed more interested in appearing in the society columns than in building a life together. "I need to take a walk before the ceremony," said Ethan, grabbing the keys to his red Ferrari. Jake tried to argue that it wasn't a good idea, but he knew his friend well enough to know it was useless to try to stop him. "Just be back in 20 minutes, Jake called after him. "Your mother will have a fit if you're late." The route along the winding road leading to the mansion had always been his refuge to organize his thoughts. The cool morning breeze came in through the car windows, bringing the scent of the ocean. As Ethan drove, memories flashed through his mind. He remembered meeting Olivia at a charity gala 3 years ago. She had walked up to him with confidence, her designer dress catching everyone's eye. "I've been wanting to meet the famous Ethan Thompson," she had said with a smile that melted his heart instantly. Their relationship had been a whirlwind. Within 6 months, they were dating exclusively. After a year, they moved in together. And now here they were, about to get married in front of 300 guests, most of whom were business associates and Olivia's society friends. Ethan slowed down as he approached a curve when a dog unexpectedly appeared on the road. As he swerved, he lost control of the vehicle. The world spun in slow motion. The impact was violent, and the last thing Ethan saw was the blue sky through the shattered windshield. At St. Luke's Hospital, the routine followed its normal flow. Sarah Miller, 28 years old, pushed her cleaning cart through the corridors of the ICU ward. Her brown hair was tied in a simple bun, and her light blue uniform contrasted with her tanned skin. Unlike many who worked there, she always dedicated a few minutes to talk to the patients, even those who were unconscious. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," she said cheerfully to an elderly woman who was recovering from heart surgery. "Those flowers your grandchildren brought look beautiful," Mrs. Wilson smiled weakly. "They brighten up the room, don't they? You're always so kind, Sarah." Sarah continued her rounds, cleaning and offering small comforts to patients. It wasn't much, but she believed that even simple kindness mattered. She had been working at St. Luke's for 5 years, ever since she had to drop out of nursing school when her mother got sick. The pay wasn't great, but the job allowed her to help people in her own way. The agitated arrival of a medical team caught her attention. She quickly moved her cart to make way for the stretcher carrying a young, well-dressed man, apparently the victim of a serious accident. "Car crash victim, male, early 30s, severe head trauma," one of the paramedics was saying. "BP dropping, pupils uneven and sluggish. He crashed once in the ambulance, but we got him back." Sarah watched as they rushed him into the trauma bay. There was something about the man's face, even covered in blood, that struck her. He didn't look like their usual patients. In the hours that followed, the hospital was taken over by reporters and photographers. The patient was Ethan Thompson, the billionaire who should have been getting married at that moment. The news spread quickly, and soon the hospital lobby was filled with reporters hoping for updates. "I can't believe it's him," Nurse Jenkins said to Sarah as they watched the commotion from the nursing station. "He's worth billions. They say he was on his way to his own wedding when it happened." Sarah observed from afar the coming and going of important people, including an elegant woman who arrived crying dramatically, but didn't stay more than 15 minutes. The woman was surrounded by photographers who captured her tearful entrance and exit. "That's the fiancée," Nurse Jenkins whispered. "Olivia something. Model or socialite, I think." Sarah nodded, feeling an unexpected pang of sympathy for the man whose wedding day had turned into a tragedy. She couldn't imagine how it would feel to go from what should have been the happiest day of your life to fighting for survival in a hospital bed. The doctors had placed Ethan in a medically induced coma to reduce the swelling in his brain. His prognosis was uncertain. The neurosurgeon had explained to the family that the next 72 hours would be critical. At night, when the movement died down, Sarah entered the room to clean. She looked at the unconscious man in the bed and felt an inexplicable compassion. The machines beeped rhythmically, monitoring every vital sign. His face, now cleaned of blood, was bruised but handsome. As she wiped the bedside table, she began to speak softly. "You know, Mr. Thompson, you chose a pretty important day to end up here. But don't worry, there are a lot of people rooting for your recovery." She had no idea that those simple words would mark the beginning of a story that would change not only Ethan's life but her own. In the days that followed, while the world speculated about the future of the Thompson Empire, something much more valuable than any fortune would be born inside that hospital room. 2 days after the accident, Alexander Thompson, Ethan's older brother, called an emergency board meeting at Thompson Technologies. The company's shares had already dropped 5 points since news of the accident broke. "Gentlemen, ladies," Alexander addressed the anxious board members, "as you know, my brother is in critical condition. The doctors are doing everything they can, but we must prepare for all possibilities." He paused, making eye contact with each person at the table before continuing. "I have here a power of attorney that Ethan signed 3 years ago, giving me authority to act on his behalf in case of incapacitation. I propose that I temporarily take over as CEO until my brother recovers." There were murmurs around the table. Most knew that the brothers had a complicated relationship. Ethan had founded the company and built it from the ground up, while Alexander had joined later, always living in his younger brother's shadow. "I believe this is what Ethan would want," Alexander added smoothly. "To keep the company stable in these uncertain times." The board voted unanimously in his favor. None wanted to risk further instability. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Olivia Rothschild made her second appearance, this time with a small entourage of friends and her personal photographer. Her eyes were red from crying, but her makeup was flawless. "Oh, my darling," she sobbed, taking Ethan's hand carefully to avoid disturbing the IV lines. "You need to wake up. Our life together was just about to begin." One of her friends made sure the photographer captured the tender moment. The images would appear in society magazines the next day, portraying Olivia as the devastated, devoted fiancée. As the days passed, a pattern emerged. Olivia would visit during the daytime hours when press was most likely to be present. She would stay for 15 to 20 minutes, pose for photos, then leave claiming she was too emotionally drained to stay longer. Alexander's visits were brief and business-focused. He would arrive with his assistant, spend a few minutes looking uncomfortable in the hospital room, then leave to give interviews about how he was keeping his brother's legacy alive at the company. The night was advancing and Sarah finished her shift with one last look at the patient. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Thompson. Tomorrow I'll bring a book to read to you. Did you know they say people in comas can hear? Maybe it'll help pass the time for you." Outside the hospital, photographers were still on stakeout, eager for any news about the billionaire's health condition. But the true story, the one no one could have predicted, was just beginning to unfold in the silent corridors of that ICU. Sarah had no idea that her simple acts of kindness would soon become the only genuine human connection in Ethan Thompson's life, or that forces were already at work to take advantage of his vulnerable state, threatening everything he had built. As she left the hospital that night, she glanced back at the building, feeling an inexplicable connection to the man in room 507. "Fight, Mr. Thompson," she whispered. "There are still good things waiting for you in this world." The days turned into weeks, and room 507 of the ICU became the stage for a parade of contrasting personalities. Olivia Rothschild, the fiancée, always appeared during the hours when there was the most press movement, wearing impeccable clothes and perfect makeup, as if each visit were a photo shoot. "My love, you need to wake up," she would say, fixing her hair while a photographer from Society and Power magazine captured the moment. "How am I going to organize our wedding without you?" Sarah, who was cleaning the corridor near the room, couldn't help but overhear these theatrical visits. She noticed how Olivia constantly checked her cell phone and barely touched Ethan. As soon as the cameras moved away, she would quickly say goodbye, always with an excuse about unavoidable commitments. "I have a charity luncheon, darling. You know how important these causes are to us?" Olivia said one day, already gathering her designer purse as the last photographer left. She blew a kiss toward the bed without actually looking at Ethan, then strutted out in her high heels. Sarah shook her head slightly as she entered the room to clean. "She could at least pretend to care when no one's watching," she muttered under her breath as she emptied the trash bin. Her own routine with Ethan was quite different. During the night shifts, when silence dominated the hospital, Sarah took advantage of her breaks to enter room 507. She always carried a different book, borrowed from the public library near her house. She started with The Little Prince, her favorite story. "What is essential is invisible to the eye," she read in a low voice, sitting in the armchair next to the bed. "You know, Mr. Thompson, sometimes I think you might be listening. It must be hard to be here alone for so long." After reading for about 20 minutes, she would tell him about her day, about the other patients, or about her life outside the hospital. "My mum's feeling better this week," she told him one night. "The new medication seems to be working. She even made dinner yesterday, nothing fancy, just spaghetti, but it was nice to see her up and around." Sarah lived in a small apartment with her mother, who suffered from chronic fatigue syndrome. It was one of the reasons she had to abandon her nursing studies. The medical bills had piled up, and she needed a full-time job. One night, Sarah noticed a subtle change in Ethan's expression. She immediately called the on-duty nurse, but the doctors assured her it was just an involuntary reflex. Even so, she maintained her routine of readings and conversations. "The doctors say you're stable now," she told him as she adjusted his pillow. "That's good news. Your brain swelling has gone down. Now we just need you to decide it's time to wake up." Meanwhile, behind the scenes of the Thompson empire, suspicious movements began to happen. Alexander, Ethan's older brother, called an extraordinary meeting of the administrative board. With an old power of attorney in hand, he gradually began to take control of the companies. "It's just temporary," he assured the shareholders, "until my brother recovers." But his eyes revealed other intentions, especially when he met secretly with Michael Davis, Ethan's main competitor in the market. They sat in a private room at an exclusive restaurant, speaking in hushed tones. "The merger would benefit us both," Michael said, swirling his expensive whiskey. "With Thompson Technologies under my umbrella, we'd control 60% of the market." Alexander nodded. "Ethan would never agree to it. He's too stubborn, too attached to the company he built. But now the decision falls to you," Michael finished for him. "And I'm prepared to make it worth your while. 20 million in an offshore account plus a position as COO in the new company. 30 million, Alexander counted. "And I want it in writing that I'll be next in line for CEO after you." Michael smiled. "You drive a hard bargain, but I think we can come to an agreement." They clinked glasses, sealing a deal that would effectively dismantle everything Ethan had built over the past decade. Alexander's visits to the hospital became increasingly rare, always accompanied by lawyers and papers for signature. He would have Ethan's limp hand guided to sign documents, claiming to the medical staff that they were routine authorizations for his care. Dr. Morgan, Ethan's neurologist, observed these visits with concern. After one such visit, he approached Sarah in the hallway. "You spend time with Mr. Thompson, don't you?" he asked. "During your breaks?" Sarah blushed, afraid she might be in trouble. "I just read to him sometimes. I heard it can help coma patients." Dr. Morgan nodded. "It can, that's actually good practice. I'm glad someone is giving him genuine attention." He hesitated before continuing. "I'm concerned about some of these document signings. They seem excessive for medical authorizations." "His brother brings a new set almost every week," Sarah confirmed. "Is that normal?" "No," Dr. Morgan said firmly. "It's not. I'm going to look into it. In the meantime, keep up what you're doing. Mr. Thompson needs someone in his corner." Sarah felt a surge of protectiveness toward Ethan. She'd observed the cold efficiency with which Alexander handled his visits, how he spoke about Ethan in the past tense as if he had already died. During her evening visit that day, she shared her concerns. "I don't trust your brother, Mr. Thompson. There's something not right about him. Dr. Morgan thinks so too. She reached out and hesitantly placed her hand over Ethan's. If you can hear me, if there's any way you can wake up soon, I think you need to. I think people are taking advantage while you're in here. Sarah observed everything with a mixture of concern and indignation. During her nightly conversations with Ethan, she shared her impressions. You have so many people around you, but sometimes you seem so alone, she commented while arranging the wilted flowers that Olivia had brought for the photos. But don't worry, as long as I'm here, you'll have company. Jake, Ethan's best friend, was the only visitor who seemed genuinely concerned. He came regularly, usually late in the evenings after work. He would sit with Ethan and talk to him about normal things, sports scores, office gossip, memories from their college days. Sarah liked Jake immediately. Unlike the others, he didn't treat Ethan like a prop or a business asset. He treated him like a friend who happened to be sick. One evening, Jake arrived just as Sarah was finishing her reading session. She jumped up, embarrassed to be caught. "Oh, I'm sorry, I was just reading to him," Jake finished with a kind smile. "That's really nice of you. I'm Jake, by the way. Ethan and I went to college together." "Sarah, I'm just a cleaning staff member, but I..." She hesitated. "You care," Jake said simply. "That's more than I can say for some people who are supposed to care about him." He jerked his head toward the door, indicating the world outside. That conversation marked the beginning of an alliance. Jake started timing his visits to overlap with Sarah's breaks. Sometimes they would read to Ethan together, with Jake filling in stories from their shared past. "Remember that road trip to Miami?" Jake said one night, laughing. "When the car broke down in that tiny town in Georgia and we had to stay in that motel that looked like something from a horror movie?" Sarah smiled as Jake continued the story, describing how Ethan had charmed the local mechanic into fixing their car for half price. "He's always been like that," Jake said fondly. "Good with people, sees the best in them." One night while reading Don Quixote, Sarah was surprised by a conversation in the corridor. Olivia was arguing with Alexander in raised tones. "We need to resolve this soon," she was saying. "I can't keep waiting indefinitely. The press is already starting to speculate about the wedding." "Be patient," Alexander replied. "Soon we'll have total control, and you'll have your part as we agreed. The prenup was going to limit me to $5 million if we divorced. That's nothing compared to what you're offering Davis for the merger." Sarah felt her heart tighten. Those words revealed much more than just concern for Ethan's health. She held her breath, listening as the conversation continued. $10 million. Olivia, tax-free as soon as the merger goes through. All you have to do is play the grieving fiancé a little longer. What if he wakes up? Olivia asked, her voice lower now. The doctors say it's unlikely, and even if he does, the paperwork will already be filed. The company will be sold. There's nothing he could do. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized the extent of their betrayal. Not only were they stealing Ethan's company, but they were also plotting together, his fiancé and his brother. She then decided that, in addition to the readings, she would start telling Ethan everything she witnessed, hoping that somehow he could hear and understand. "You need to wake up," she whispered gently, holding his hand. "There's a lot going on that you need to know. Your brother and Olivia, they're planning something bad. They're going to sell your company, and they're working together behind your back." That night, for the first time, Sarah felt a slight squeeze on her hand. It was so subtle that she could have imagined it, but her heart knew it was real. The heart monitor registered a small change, and she smiled, keeping that moment as a precious secret between them. The next morning, Sarah sought out Dr. Morgan. "I need to talk to you about Mr. Thompson," she said urgently. "I overheard his brother and fiancé talking. They're planning to sell his company while he's unconscious. They've made some kind of deal." Dr. Morgan looked troubled. "That would explain the excessive paperwork, but without proof there's not much we can do legally. What if he has other family, someone who would actually look out for his interests? His parents passed away years ago, from what I understand. It's just him and his brother." Sarah thought of Jake. "What about friends? Could a friend get some kind of legal protection for him?" "Possibly," Dr. Morgan said thoughtfully. "A court-appointed conservator might be able to block any major business decisions until Mr. Thompson recovers. But it would be a legal battle, especially with the brother holding power of attorney." Sarah thanked him and made a plan to talk to Jake at his next visit. Someone needed to stand up for Ethan before it was too late. Outside the hospital, life went on. The headlines about the billionaire in a coma were beginning to lose space to other scandals, but in the corridors of St. Luke's, a story of loyalty and true affection continued to develop, silent and deep, like the words of the books Sarah read every night. That evening, when Sarah entered room 507, she noticed something different. Ethan's face seemed more relaxed, less pale. She checked his chart and saw that his vital signs had improved slightly. "I think you're fighting back," she said softly, taking her usual seat. "That's good. There are people who still need you in this world, Mr. Thompson. Real people who care about the man, not the money." She opened her book to continue where they had left off the previous night. As she read, she occasionally glanced up at Ethan's face, hoping to see another sign of awareness. What she didn't know was that deep in Ethan's mind, a battle was being fought. Fragments of conversations, whispered words, and familiar voices were slowly penetrating the darkness of his coma. And among them, clear and constant, was the voice of a woman he had never met but who was becoming his lifeline back to consciousness. Autumn arrived in New York City, painting the trees in the hospital garden with golden hues. It had been 2 months since the accident, and the routine in room 507 had settled into a familiar pattern. But October brought with it a subtle shift in the air and in Ethan Thompson's condition. Sarah arrived for her evening shift to find Dr. Morgan examining Ethan, a cautiously optimistic expression on his face. His EEG showed increased brain activity. "Today," the doctor explained when he noticed Sarah hovering in the doorway. "And his reflexes are stronger. These are good signs." Sarah's heart leaped with hope. "Does that mean he might wake up soon?" "I can't make any promises," Dr. Morgan cautioned. "Brain injuries are unpredictable, but yes, these changes suggest his condition is improving." After the doctor left, Sarah set about her usual cleaning duties with renewed energy. As she wiped down the bedside table, she spoke to Ethan as she always did. "Did you hear that, Mr. Thompson? Your brain is working harder. I always knew you were a fighter." She paused her work and moved closer to the bed, studying his face. The bruises from the accident had long since faded, and with his features relaxed in sleep, he looked younger, vulnerable. "Jake is coming by later," she continued. "I told him about what I overheard between your brother and Olivia. He was furious. He's been talking to a lawyer friend about getting a court order to protect your interests." Sarah had finally confided in Jake about the conversation she'd overheard. Jake wasn't surprised about Olivia. He had never fully trusted her intentions with Ethan, but Alexander's betrayal had hit him hard. "I always knew he was jealous of Ethan's success," Jake had said bitterly. "But to sell out his own brother while he's fighting for his life, that's a new low." Jake had immediately contacted his friend Brian Coleman, a corporate attorney, who was looking into legal options to challenge Alexander's power of attorney. As Sarah arranged fresh flowers in the vase, daisies she had bought herself, not the elaborate arrangements Olivia occasionally sent for show, the door opened. She turned, expecting to see a nurse, but instead found Alexander Thompson standing there, his expression darkening when he saw her. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded. Sarah straightened her shoulders. "My job, sir. I'm assigned to clean this room." Alexander's eyes narrowed as he took in the book on the side table. The daisies, the comfortable arrangement of the chair pulled close to the bed. "Looks like you're making yourself quite at home. Don't you have other rooms to clean?" Before Sarah could respond, a soft sound came from the bed, a low moan, barely audible. Both Sarah and Alexander froze, then turned toward Ethan. His eyes remained closed, but his fingers twitched slightly against the sheets. "Mr. Thompson." Sarah moved to his side instantly. "Ethan, can you hear me?" Alexander pushed her aside roughly. "Get the doctor, now." Sarah hurried to the nurse's station, her heart pounding. Dr. Morgan arrived within minutes and examined Ethan thoroughly while Alexander paced the room. "These are definitely signs of increasing consciousness," Dr. Morgan confirmed. "His brain is trying to wake up. This is very encouraging." "How long until he's fully conscious?" Alexander demanded, his voice tense. "It could be days, weeks, or longer," the doctor replied. The brain heals on its own timeline, but I'm optimistic about his progress. After Dr. Morgan left, Alexander turned to Sarah, who had lingered by the door. "Don't you have somewhere else to be?" he asked coldly. "I was just concerned about Mr. Thompson," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Alexander stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Let me make something clear. You are the cleaning staff, nothing more. Whatever little fantasy you've built up in your head about my brother, forget it. If he wakes up, he won't even remember you were here." Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she held his gaze. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Thompson. Part of that is caring about the patients." "Well, do your job somewhere else for now. I need privacy with my brother." Once Sarah had left, Alexander pulled out his phone and made a hurried call. "We need to move faster," he said tersely. "The doctors are saying he might wake up." "Yes, I know what we agreed, but we don't have the luxury of time anymore. Just get the paperwork ready. I'll sign everything tomorrow." Outside in the hallway, Sarah leaned against the wall, her heart racing. Ethan had shown signs of waking up, and she had been there to see it. But Alexander's reaction troubled her deeply. He hadn't seemed happy or relieved. He had seemed panicked. She needed to tell Jake right away. Later that evening, Jake arrived with Brian Coleman, the attorney. They found Sarah waiting anxiously in the cafeteria. He moved his fingers and made a sound, she explained breathlessly. "Dr. Morgan says it's a good sign, but Alexander seemed upset about it, not happy. I overheard him on the phone saying they need to move faster and that he'd sign some paperwork tomorrow." Brian frowned. "They're rushing the merger. If we're going to stop this, we need to act immediately." "What can we do?" Jake asked. "I've prepared an emergency petition to revoke Alexander's power of attorney based on conflict of interest. We'll file it first thing in the morning, but we'll need evidence of his plans to sell the company against Ethan's interests." Sarah bit her lip. "I overheard the conversation, but it's just my word against theirs." "That's a start," Brian said, "but we'll need more. Financial records, communications between Alexander and Davis, anything that proves they're planning this merger." Jake nodded grimly. "I still have access to Ethan's home office. There might be something there that could help us." As they talked, Sarah's phone beeped. With a text message from Nurse Jenkins. "Alexander Thompson just left. Olivia arrived. Thought you'd want to know." Sarah excused herself and hurried back to Ethan's room. She found Olivia standing by the bed, not touching Ethan, but staring at him with a strange expression. Not love or concern, but calculation. "I heard there was a change in his condition," Olivia said, without looking up when Sarah entered. "Yes," Sarah replied, beginning to straighten items around the room as an excuse to stay. "He showed signs of increased awareness today." Olivia's perfectly manicured hand tightened on her designer purse. How wonderful! The lack of enthusiasm in her voice was palpable. She checked her watch and sighed. "I suppose I should stay longer than usual tonight, given the circumstances." "The press will expect it." She perched delicately on the edge of the visitor's chair, careful not to wrinkle her expensive dress. Sarah continued her work silently, observing Olivia from the corner of her eye. The woman was a study in contrasts, outwardly beautiful but cold inside like a porcelain doll. After a few minutes of awkward silence, Olivia's phone rang. She answered immediately, speaking in hushed tones. "Yes, I'm with him now. No, he's still unconscious, but they're saying there are signs of improvement." "I know what's at stake, Alexander." Sarah pretended to be focused on her cleaning, but her ears strained to catch every word. "Tomorrow, that soon?" Olivia continued, her voice rising slightly before she controlled it. "Fine, I'll be there. Just make sure everything is in order. We can't afford any mistakes." She ended the call and turned to find Sarah watching her. A flash of suspicion crossed her face. "Are you finished yet?" Olivia asked coldly. "Almost," Sarah replied, moving to empty the trash bin. "I just need to—" She was interrupted by another soft sound from Ethan. Both women turned to the bed. This time Ethan's eyelids fluttered slightly, though they didn't open. Sarah moved to his side instantly. "Mr. Thompson, can you hear me?" Count to her. Her surprise, Olivia didn't approach the bed. Instead, she backed toward the door. "I should get the doctor," she said, but her voice betrayed panic rather than concern. Before she could leave, Dr. Morgan entered the room. The monitors at the nurse's station showed a change in his vital signs, he explained, moving to examine Ethan. While the doctor checked Ethan's responses, Sarah noticed Olivia typing frantically on her phone. A moment later, Olivia's phone rang, and she stepped into the hallway to answer it. Dr. Morgan looked up with a smile. His responses are definitely stronger. I think we may see him regain consciousness within the next few days if this progression continues. That's wonderful news, Sarah said sincerely. Olivia re-entered the room, her composure regained. Yes, wonderful, she echoed without enthusiasm. Doctor, may I speak with you outside for a moment? As they left the room, Sarah moved to Ethan's side, taking his hand gently in hers. Did you hear that? You're coming back to us, she whispered. Keep fighting, Ethan. There are people trying to help you, Jake, Dr. Morgan, me. We won't let them take everything from you. To her astonishment, Ethan's fingers curled slightly around hers. A definite squeeze, not just a reflex. Tears sprang to her eyes. That's it, she encouraged. You can do this. Come back to us. When Olivia and Dr. Morgan returned, Sarah reluctantly released Ethan's hand and stepped back. The doctor continued his examination while Olivia stood near the door, as if preparing for a quick exit. I've explained to Ms. Rothschild that Mr. Thompson's condition is improving, but he may still have a long recovery ahead, Dr. Morgan said. Even if he regains consciousness, he may have memory issues, difficulty speaking, or other neurological challenges. Olivia nodded absently. I understand. I should go now. I have an early meeting tomorrow. Please call me if there's any significant change. After Olivia left, Dr. Morgan turned to Sarah with a knowing look. She didn't seem particularly thrilled by her fiancé's improvement. Sarah hesitated, then decided to trust the doctor. I think she and Alexander Thompson are planning something that would be easier if Ethan didn't wake up. Dr. Morgan's expression grew serious. What kind of something? Selling his company to his biggest competitor. I overheard them talking about it. She explained everything she knew, including Jake's efforts to get legal help. Dr. Morgan listened thoughtfully. As Ethan's doctor, my primary concern is his health, but I can't ignore what you're telling me, especially if the stress of losing his company could impact his recovery. He sighed. I'll document everything about his condition very carefully. If there's a legal challenge, my records will show he was improving right when these business decisions were being made. Thank you, Doctor. After Dr. Morgan left, Sarah returned to Ethan's side for a moment before finishing her shift. I need to go now, she told him softly, but I'll be back tomorrow. A lot is happening, Ethan. Your brother and Olivia are up to something big tomorrow. Jake and his lawyer friend are trying to stop them. And you're fighting your way back. She squeezed his hand gently. Keep fighting. We'll be here when you wake up. That night Sarah could hardly sleep. Her mind raced with thoughts of Ethan, of the conspiracy against him, of the way his hand had squeezed hers. She had crossed a line today, calling him by his first name, holding his hand longer than was professionally appropriate. But somehow none of that seemed to matter anymore. What mattered was protecting him. The next morning she arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. To her surprise, she found Jake already there, looking exhausted but determined. I was at Ethan's house all night, he explained. Found some interesting emails on his home computer. Alexander had been trying to get Ethan to consider a merger with Davis Enterprises for months. Ethan refused every time, called it corporate suicide. But the most interesting thing was this. He showed Sarah a document on his phone, a draft, prenuptial agreement between Ethan and Olivia. Look at the terms, Jake pointed out. If they divorced, she would get $5 million. But if Ethan died before they married, she would get nothing. Absolutely nothing. Sarah's eyes widened. So she has no financial interest in him unless they actually get married. Exactly. Which makes her partnership with Alexander even more suspicious. Why would she help him sell the company if she doesn't benefit from Ethan's assets? Unless Alexander is paying her separately, Sarah realized. That's what I overheard. He promised her part once they had control. Jake nodded grimly. Brian is filing the emergency petition this morning, but Alexander is moving fast. He called an emergency board meeting for noon today. As they were talking, Dr. Morgan approached, his face serious. "I need to speak with you both," he said quietly. "It's about Ethan Thompson. There's been a significant change in his condition overnight." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Is he worse? What happened?" Dr. Morgan's serious expression softened into a smile. "Quite the opposite. He opened his eyes for the first time about an hour ago." "He's awake?" Jake exclaimed. "Not fully conscious yet," the doctor cautioned. He opened his eyes briefly and responded to simple commands. "Squeeze my hand, blink once." Then he drifted back to sleep, which is normal. But this is a huge step forward. I expect him to have longer periods of consciousness over the next few days. Sarah felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. "Has his brother been notified?" "Not yet. I wanted to examine him thoroughly first. Given what you told me, I thought it best to be cautious about who knows what and when." Jake checked his watch. "The board meeting is in 3 hours. If word gets out that Ethan is waking up, Alexander might rush the vote," Sarah finished. Dr. Morgan nodded. "Exactly. I can delay notifying the family for a few hours on medical grounds. That might give your lawyer friend time to file his petition." As they were speaking, the door to Ethan's room opened and a nurse stepped out. "Dr. Morgan, he's awake again. And he's trying to speak." The three of them hurried into the room. Sarah's heart pounded as she saw Ethan's eyes, open and alert for the first time since the accident. Those eyes, a deep hazel color she hadn't been able to see until now, moved. Slowly around the room, finally settling on Jake. "Jake," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. Jake moved to his friend's side, gripping his hand. "Ethan, man, it's good to see you awake." Ethan's brow furrowed with confusion. "What happened?" Dr. Morgan stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Dr. Morgan. You were in a car accident. You've been in a coma for 2 months." Ethan's eyes widened. 2 months. "Don't try to talk too much," the doctor advised. "Your body needs time to adjust. Just rest and know that you're recovering." Well, Ethan's gaze drifted past Jake and Dr. Morgan, finally landing on Sarah, who stood nervously by the foot of the bed. A flicker of recognition passed across his face. "I know you," he whispered. "Your voice." Sarah stepped closer, her heart racing. "Yes, I'm Sarah. I've been taking care of your room." "You read to me," Ethan said softly. "Don Quixote, and you're the little prince." Tears filled Sarah's eyes. He had heard her all along. Dr. Morgan looked impressed. "Memory during coma is rare, but not unheard of. This is an excellent sign for his cognitive recovery." Ethan tried to sit up but winced with the effort. "Olivia, my brother?" Jake and Sarah exchanged glances. Dr. Morgan stepped in smoothly. "Let's focus on your immediate recovery for now, Mr. Thompson. There will be time to catch up on everything else." Ethan seemed too weak to argue. His eyes drifted closed again, but before he fell asleep, his hand reached out, searching. Sarah hesitated, then took it gently in hers. A small smile touched his lips before he drifted off. "This is incredible progress," Dr. Morgan said quietly, "but he needs rest. His brain is still healing." As they stepped out of the room, Jake's phone rang. It was Brian, the lawyer. "The petition has been filed," Jake reported after a brief conversation. "The judge is reviewing it now, but we're cutting it close with that board meeting." Sarah looked back at Ethan's sleeping form through the door window. "What if we could delay the meeting?" "How?" Jake asked. Sarah's mind raced. "Olivia, she's part of this plan, right? And she's supposed to be at the meeting?" "Yes, Alexander wants her there to maintain the appearance that she's still the grieving fiancée, supporting his decisions for Ethan's company. But what if she found out Ethan was awake? What would she do?" Jake caught on immediately. She'd panic. She might not show up at all, which would make Alexander look suspicious to the board. Exactly. And we know she's not genuinely happy about Ethan waking up, but she has to pretend to be. That would throw off their timeline at least. Jake nodded slowly. "It might work, but we can't officially notify her yet, or Alexander would know too." "Leave that to me," Sarah said with newfound determination. She pulled out her phone and opened her social media account, something she rarely used. Time to spread some unofficial News. Within an hour, Sarah's carefully worded post about a miraculous awakening at St. Luke's Hospital had spread through the hospital staff's social networks. She hadn't named Ethan specifically, but she had included enough details that anyone following the story would connect the dots. By noon, reporters had gathered outside the hospital, and Olivia's phone was ringing non-stop with friends asking if the rumors were true. The board meeting was delayed when both Olivia and Alexander failed to arrive on time. Olivia was rushing to the hospital to maintain appearances, and Alexander was frantically trying to reach her. Meanwhile, in room 507, Ethan Thompson opened his eyes again, more alert this time, and the first person he saw was Sarah, sitting patiently by his side, ready to help him face whatever came next. The hospital lobby was chaos. Reporters crowded the entrance, security guards tried to maintain order, and staff hurried through with frustrated expressions. The news of Ethan Thompson's awakening had spread like wildfire, despite the hospital's attempts to neither confirm nor deny the rumors. Olivia Rothschild pushed through the crowd, her designer sunglasses hiding her eyes, but not the tense set of her jaw. She was dressed impeccably as always, in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in 3 months. "Ms. Rothschild, is it true your fiancé has awakened from his coma?" a reporter called out. "How does it feel to know he's coming?" "Back to you?" shouted another. Olivia forced a trembling smile. "I'm overwhelmed with joy. I've prayed for this moment for so long." Sarah watched from the nurses' station, where she had positioned herself specifically to observe Olivia's arrival. Jake stood beside her, his expression grim. "She's good," he muttered. "If I didn't know better, I'd believe she was actually happy." "The tears are a nice touch," Sarah agreed, noting the perfectly formed droplet that slid down Olivia's cheek, not smudging her makeup in the slightest. The elevator doors opened and Alexander Thompson emerged, his expression thunderous. When he spotted Olivia surrounded by reporters, he strode toward her, grabbing her elbow firmly. "Darling, let's go upstairs. This isn't the place," he said loudly enough for the reporters to hear. His smile was as fake as Olivia's tears. As soon as they were in the elevator and the doors closed, Alexander dropped the act. "What the hell is going on? The board is waiting. Davis is threatening to pull out of the deal if we don't vote today." "I had to come," Olivia hissed back. "Everyone was calling me about Ethan waking up. How would it look if I wasn't here? Besides, we need to know how much he remembers, what he's able to communicate." The elevator doors opened on Ethan's floor and Sarah quickly turned away, pretending to organize supplies. Jake had already slipped into Ethan's room to warn Dr. Morgan about the incoming storm. Inside room 507, Ethan was more alert than he had been earlier. He was propped up slightly on pillows, his eyes clearer, though still heavy with exhaustion. Dr. Morgan stood at his bedside reviewing his chart, while Jake sat in the visitor's chair. "They're coming up now," Jake warned. "Both of them." Dr. Morgan nodded. "Mr. Thompson, your brother and fiancé are on their way to see you. Are you feeling up to visitors?" Ethan's brow furrowed. "Yes, I want to see them." His voice was still, weak, but there was determination in it. Jake leaned forward. "Ethan, there's something you should know before—" The door swung open, cutting him off. Olivia rushed in, her face a perfect mask of joyful surprise. "Ethan! Oh my God, it's true!" She hurried to his side, taking his hand in hers. "My love, you've come back to me." Alexander followed more slowly, his eyes calculating as he assessed his brother's condition. "Welcome back, little brother. You gave us quite a scare." Ethan looked from one to the other, his expression unreadable. "How long, exactly?" he asked, his words slightly slurred but intelligible. 2 months, Alexander supplied smoothly. "Don't worry about anything. I've been taking care of the company while you recover. And I've been here every day," Olivia added, stroking his arm, "talking to you, praying for you to wake up." Jake couldn't contain himself. "Every day? That's interesting, considering most of the staff barely recognize you." Olivia shot him a venomous glare. "Of course I couldn't be here 24/7. I have responsibilities, charity work." Dr. Morgan stepped in professionally. "Mr. Thompson needs to rest. His condition has improved remarkably, but his recovery is still in the early stages. I must ask that you keep this visit brief." Alexander's phone buzzed. He checked it, his expression darkening. "Olivia, we have that important meeting, remember? We should go." "But I just got here," she protested, still clinging to Ethan's hand. "I can't leave now." "It's important," Alexander insisted, giving her a meaningful look. Ethan's fingers closed weakly around Olivia's. "What meeting?" The room fell silent. Alexander recovered first. "Just some foundation business. Nothing for you to worry about. Thompson." "Foundation?" Ethan asked, his eyes sharper now. "Or company?" Jake stood up. "Actually, it's an emergency board meeting at Thompson Technologies to vote on the merger with Davis Enterprises." The color drained from Alexander's face. "That's confidential board business." "Merger?" Ethan repeated, struggling to sit up further. "No merger. I rejected that deal." Alexander's expression hardened. "The circumstances have changed, Ethan. The company needs this to survive. As acting CEO..." "You are not CEO," Ethan said, his voice stronger now, fueled by anger. "Acting or otherwise. I have power." "Of attorney," Alexander countered. "The board has already..." He was interrupted by a commotion at the door. Brian Coleman entered, followed by a court officer holding papers. "Alexander Thompson." The officer asked. Alexander turned. "Yes? What is this about?" The officer handed him a document. "By order of Judge Williams, your power of attorney for Ethan Thompson and all authority to act on his behalf is temporarily suspended pending investigation of conflict of interest and breach of fiduciary duty." "This is ridiculous," Alexander sputtered, scanning the document. "You can't..." "Actually, we can," Brian said calmly. "And we have. The emergency meeting is also stayed by court order until Mr. Thompson's competency can be properly evaluated by independent medical experts." Olivia looked panicked. She turned to Ethan, still trying to maintain her facade. "Darling, this is all a mistake. Your brother was only doing what's best for the company, for us." Ethan's gaze shifted to her, his expression hardening. "Us? There is no us." "What are you saying?" Olivia gasped. "Of course there is. We're engaged. We're getting married." "Voice," Ethan said, his speech still labored but increasingly clear. "Heard your voice. Planning with him." He gestured weakly toward Alexander. "Heard everything." Olivia paled. "I don't know what you're talking about. You were in a coma. You couldn't have heard." "Coma patients sometimes retain partial awareness," Dr. Morgan interjected, "including auditory perception. It's well documented in medical literature." Jake stepped forward. "We also have records of your meetings with Davis, Alexander. Emails from Ethan's home computer, showing he repeatedly rejected this merger, and witnesses who overheard your conversations with Olivia about your arrangement." Alexander's face contorted with rage. "This is absurd. You have no proof of anything." "10 million, Ethan said suddenly. Everyone turned to him. "Promised her. 10 million. Tax-free." Olivia's jaw dropped. She stared at Ethan in horror, then at Alexander. "He really hurt us." Sarah, who had been watching from the doorway, felt a surge of satisfaction. Ethan had heard them that night when she was reading in his room, the night Olivia and Alexander had their incriminating conversation in the hallway. Alexander recovered quickly, his lawyer's mind already calculating. Ethan is clearly confused. His brain has been damaged. He's mixing up reality with dreams or things he's been told since waking up. "We'll let the court decide that," Brian replied calmly. "In the meantime, all business decisions at Thompson Technologies are frozen." Alexander's phone buzzed again. He checked it and cursed under his breath. "This isn't over," he snapped, then strode out of the room. Olivia hesitated, torn between following Alexander and maintaining her act. "Ethan, darling, you need to rest. You're confused. When you're feeling better, we'll sort this all out." "Ring," Ethan said flatly. "What?" Olivia blinked. "Engagement ring. Want it back?" Olivia's face flushed with anger. "You can't be serious. After everything I've been through, now." Ethan's voice was quiet, but firm. With a furious glare, Olivia yanked the massive diamond ring from her finger and slammed it on the bedside table. "You'll regret this," she hissed, then stormed out. As the door closed behind her, Ethan sagged back against the pillows, exhausted by the confrontation. "That was quite a performance for someone who just woke up from a coma," Dr. Morgan observed, checking Ethan's vital signs. "Had to stop them," Ethan managed, his energy clearly flagging. Jake squeezed his friend's shoulder. "And you did. Rest now, we'll handle everything else." Ethan's eyes drifted around the room until they landed on Sarah, still standing by the door. A faint smile touched his lips. "Sarah," he whispered, "thank you for the books." Sarah stepped forward, suddenly shy now that he was awake and looking at her. "You're welcome, Mr. Thompson." "Ethan," he corrected softly. "Please." Dr. Morgan finished his examination. "Your vital signs are stable, but that was more excitement than I would have recommended for your first day of consciousness. You need to rest now." Ethan nodded sleepily, his eyes already drooping, but he reached out a hand towards Sarah. "Stay? Just for a while?" Sarah glanced at Dr. Morgan, who nodded almost imperceptibly. She moved to the chair beside the bed and gently took Ethan's hand. "I'll stay," she promised. Within moments, Ethan had drifted off to sleep, his hand still loosely holding hers. "I'll wait outside," Jake said quietly. "Brian and I need to discuss next steps. This is just the beginning of what will likely be a messy legal battle." After Jake and Brian left, Dr. Morgan updated Ethan's chart, then turned to Sarah. "You know, Ms. Miller, in my 30 years of practice, I've seen many remarkable recoveries. But I've never seen a patient recognize the voice of someone who read to them during a coma with such clarity." He smiled warmly. "You've given him something rare, a reason to fight his way back." Sarah blushed. "I was just being kind. Sometimes kindness is the most powerful medicine we have." He closed the chart. "I'll make sure you're allowed to visit outside your work hours if you'd like. I think your presence is beneficial to his recovery." "Thank you, Dr. Morgan." After the doctor left, Sarah sat quietly beside Ethan, watching his peaceful sleep. So much had happened so quickly. Just yesterday, she had been the cleaning lady who read books to an unconscious billionaire. Today, she had helped stop a corporate takeover and found herself acknowledged as someone important to Ethan's recovery. It was overwhelming and surreal. Yet sitting here, holding his hand, felt strangely natural, as if all those one-sided conversations had built a connection neither of them fully understood yet. Outside the hospital, the wheels of justice and business were turning rapidly. News of Ethan's awakening and the court order halting the board meeting had leaked to the press. Thompson Technologies' stock had initially plummeted on rumors of leadership chaos, then rebounded when word spread that Ethan himself had personally intervened to stop a potentially disastrous merger. Alexander and Olivia were not giving up easily. They held an impromptu press conference on the hospital steps, portraying themselves as victims of a conspiracy. "My brother is severely confused and being manipulated by people taking advantage of his vulnerable state," Alexander declared to the cameras. "As his family, Olivia and I only want what's best for him and the company he built." Olivia dabbed at non-existent tears. "Ethan isn't himself. Brain injuries can drastically change personality and cognition. The doctors have warned us he may never fully recover his memories or judgment. I'm standing by him, despite these challenges, because I love him." Jake watched the performance on the television in the hospital waiting room, shaking his head in disgust. "They're setting up a competency challenge. They'll try to prove he's not mentally capable of making decisions about the company or his personal life." Brian nodded grimly. "It's a standard play in these situations. We need to get independent neurological experts in here as soon as possible to document his cognitive abilities." "Dr. Morgan will help with that," Sarah assured them. She had taken a short break from Ethan's room while he slept. "He's already documenting everything carefully." "Good," Brian said, "but this is going to get ugly before it gets better. Alexander knows that even if he can't push through the merger right away, he can create enough doubt about Ethan's competency to maintain control for months. And in the meantime, he could still damage the company," Jake added. Fire loyal employees, alter contracts, drain resources. Sarah thought for a moment. What if Ethan could speak publicly, show people he's recovering and aware? Brian looked skeptical. It's too soon. He can barely string together full sentences, but he understands everything, Sarah insisted. And what he said today was clear enough. If people could see him, hear him say he opposes the merger. Jake's eyes lit up. That could work. Not a full press conference, but maybe a short recorded statement. Something to counter Alexander's narrative that he's completely incapacitated. I'll run it by Dr. Morgan, Sarah said. If he approves from a medical standpoint, would that help? Legally, Brian? The lawyer nodded thoughtfully. It could. Public perception matters in corporate battles like this. If shareholders and the board see Ethan alert and opposed to the merger, it strengthens our position tremendously. Sarah returned to Ethan's room to find him awake again, looking more alert than before. The short nap seemed to have restored some of his energy. Sarah, he greeted her with a small smile. You came back. I promised I would, she replied, resuming her seat beside his bed. How are you feeling? Clearer, he said. Stronger. His speech was less slurred now, though still deliberate. Alexander and Olivia, they're planning something else. Yes, Sarah admitted. They're telling the press you're confused, that your brain injury has affected your judgment. Ethan's jaw tightened. Need to stop them. We have an idea about that, but it would involve you making a short recorded statement. Dr. Morgan would need to approve it medically. Do you think you could do that? Ethan nodded firmly. Yes, have to. Dr. Morgan was initially hesitant, but after examining Ethan again and finding his cognitive function continuing to improve, he agreed to allow a brief, controlled recording session. 5 minutes maximum, he instructed, and I'll be monitoring his vital signs the entire time. If I see any signs of stress or fatigue, we stop immediately. Jake arranged for a trusted journalist, an old college friend who worked for a respected business publication, to conduct a brief interview. By late afternoon, everything was set up in Ethan's room. The bed had been adjusted so he could sit more upright, and Sarah had helped him look more presentable, combing his hair and helping him into a button-down shirt Jake had brought from his home. Remember, short answers conserve your energy, Dr. Morgan advised. Don't push yourself. The journalist, David Chen, had agreed to ask only pre-approved questions. The camera crew set up quickly and discreetly. We're rolling in 3, 2, 1, the cameraman counted down. I'm David Chen here with Ethan Thompson, CEO of Thompson Technologies, who has just awakened from a 2-month coma following a car accident on what was to be his wedding day. Mr. Thompson, thank you for speaking with us during your recovery. Thank you for coming, Ethan replied carefully, his voice quiet but clear. Mr. Thompson, there are rumors about a potential merger between Thompson Technologies and Davis Enterprises. Can you clarify your position on this? Ethan's expression hardened. No merger, never wanted it. Bad for company and bad for employees. Your brother Alexander has suggested that your medical condition may be affecting your judgment on business matters. How do you respond to that? My body is weak, Ethan said slowly. My mind is clear. Alexander wants control, has wanted it for years. And what about your personal relationship with your former fiancée, Olivia Rothschild? Ethan's gaze was steady. Over. She conspired with my brother. Heard them during coma. Planning to take everything. David looked suitably shocked by this revelation. You're saying you could hear conversations while you were in a coma? Yes, many conversations. Ethan's eyes briefly found Sarah, who stood off camera. Good ones and bad ones. What are your plans now as you recover? Protect my company, truth will come out. Ethan paused, gathering strength for his final statement. I built Thompson Technologies to help people, not to be sold off in pieces. My brother will not take that from me. Dr. Morgan signaled that time was up. David wrapped up the interview smoothly, and the camera crew packed up quickly. That was perfect, Jake said enthusiastically once they had left. Clear, coherent, and absolutely devastating to Alexander's claims. Ethan looked exhausted but satisfied. When will it air? Tonight, David had promised. Prime time, and we'll release quotes to other outlets immediately. Sarah helped Ethan settle back against his pillows. "You should rest now. You've done more than enough for one day." He caught her hand. "Stay, please." "Of course," she promised. "I'm not going anywhere." As Ethan drifted off to sleep, the fallout from his statement was already beginning. Alexander and Olivia's phones rang constantly, with calls from reporters seeking comments on Ethan's explosive allegations. Thompson Technologies board members began releasing statements supporting Ethan and distancing themselves from Alexander's actions. By evening, the tide had turned dramatically. The court ordered a freeze on all of Alexander's access to company, resources pending a full investigation. Olivia's carefully cultivated image as the devoted fiancée was shattered as excerpts from Ethan's interview went viral. Sarah watched the news coverage on the small TV in Ethan's room, keeping the volume low so as not to disturb his sleep. The reporter was standing outside Thompson Technologies headquarters. In a stunning development, Ethan Thompson, who awakened from a coma just today, has accused his brother and former fiancée of conspiring to take control of his multi-billion-dollar company. Thompson appeared alert and determined. In an exclusive interview, directly contradicting claims that he is cognitively impaired. Thompson Technologies stock has rallied on the news that its founder is not only awake, but apparently in command of his faculties and business judgment. Sarah muted the television as Ethan stirred. His eyes opened, finding her immediately. "Did it work?" he asked. "Yes," she assured him with a smile. "It worked perfectly." He smiled back, the first full, genuine smile she had seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger, more like the confident businessman she'd seen in photographs. "Couldn't have done it without you," he said softly. "You saved everything." Sarah blushed. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Ethan said firmly. "Not what anyone would do. What someone special would do." His eyes held hers. "Someone with a good heart." Before Sarah could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Jake poked his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you'd want to know. Alexander just tried to access the company's offshore accounts and was denied. He's been locked out of everything." Ethan nodded with satisfaction. "Good. What about Olivia?" "Last seen throwing designer luggage into her car. Word is she's headed for the airport." "Running," Ethan observed. "Typical." "The board wants to meet with you as soon as you're able," Jake continued. "Not to pressure you, but they're anxious to hear directly from you." "Tomorrow," Ethan decided. "I'll be stronger tomorrow." As Jake left to make the arrangements, Ethan turned back to Sarah. "Thank you for believing in me when I was just a patient." Sarah smiled softly. "You were never just a patient to me." Outside the hospital, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The day that had begun with uncertainty had ended with a clear victory. The first of many battles to come, but an important one. For the first time in 2 months, Ethan Thompson was back in control of his life and his company. And for the first time ever, Sarah Miller found herself inexplicably, undeniably drawn into a world she had never imagined could include her. Neither of them knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. But as Ethan drifted back to sleep, his hand still holding Sarah's, one thing was certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The next morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the partially open blinds in room 507. Ethan woke slowly, blinking against the light. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind. Where was he? Then the memories of the previous day came flooding back, awakening from the coma, confronting Alexander and Olivia, the interview. He turned his head and saw Sarah asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still loosely holding his. She had stayed all night just as she promised. In sleep, her face was peaceful, the worry lines that had creased her forehead yesterday smoothed away. Ethan studied her, trying to reconcile the voice he had come to know during his darkness with the woman before him now. Sarah's eyes fluttered open as if sensing his gaze. She straightened immediately, a blush coloring her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she said, quickly releasing his hand. "I didn't mean to fall asleep." "Don't apologize," Ethan replied, his voice stronger today, the words coming more easily. "You deserve the rest." Sarah smoothed her rumpled uniform. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Better," he said, and it was true. The fog that had clouded his thinking yesterday was lighter today. Still weak, but clearer. Dr. Morgan entered, bringing with him an air of brisk efficiency. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. You're looking much improved." The doctor performed a thorough examination, checking Ethan's reflexes, pupil response, and cognitive function. He asked a series of questions to test memory and reasoning, which Ethan answered with increasing confidence. "Remarkable progress," Dr. Morgan declared when he had finished. "Your brain is healing faster than I would have predicted. We'll need to start physical therapy soon to address the muscle atrophy from your extended bed rest, but neurologically you're exceeding all expectations. When can I leave?" Ethan asked. Dr. Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. You've only been conscious for a day. While your cognitive recovery is impressive, your body needs time to regain strength. I'd estimate at least another week in the hospital, followed by intensive rehabilitation." Ethan frowned. "I have a company to save. And you won't be much use to your company if you collapse from pushing too hard too soon," the doctor countered. "However, I am willing to approve short business meetings here in your room, provided they don't exceed 30 minutes, and you rest between them." Ethan nodded, accepting the compromise. "The board wants to meet today." "Very well, but I'll be monitoring your vital signs remotely, and I'll end the meeting if I see signs of stress or fatigue." After Dr. Morgan left, Sarah helped Ethan with his breakfast. His hands were still somewhat unsteady, a result of the muscle weakness from his long immobility. "This is frustrating," he muttered, as he struggled to hold the spoon steady. "It's temporary," Sarah assured him. "Your muscles just need time to remember how to work properly." Ethan looked at her curiously. "You know a lot about medical recovery." Sarah smiled a little sadly. "I was in nursing school before I had to drop out. My mother got sick and I needed a full-time job to cover the medical bills." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, genuinely moved by her situation. "That must have been difficult." "It was the right choice," she said simply. "Family comes first." He studied her face. "You're very different from the people I usually know." "Rich people, you mean?" Sarah asked with a hint of teasing. Ethan laughed softly. "Yes, people who measure success in dollars and business deals." His expression grew serious. "People like my brother and Olivia." "Not everyone with money is like them," Sarah said. "Your friend Jake seems like a good person." "He is," Ethan agreed. "One of the few I can truly trust, it seems." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Along with you." Before Sarah could respond, the door opened and Jake entered, followed by Brian Coleman and two distinguished-looking men in business suits. "Sorry to interrupt," Jake said, taking in the scene with a quick glance. "The board members are here. For the emergency meeting, Dr. Morgan approved 30 minutes. Sarah stood quickly. "I should go." "No," Ethan said firmly, reaching for her hand. "Stay, please. I want you here." Sarah hesitated, looking uncomfortable amidst the powerful business figures now filling the room. "Are you sure? This is company business. You're the reason I still have a company," Ethan said simply. "I want you to hear this." Reluctantly, Sarah sat back down, acutely aware of the curious glances from the board members. Jake made the introductions. "Ethan, you remember Richard Grayson, chairman of the board, and Howard Mendez, chief financial officer." Both men stepped forward to carefully shake Ethan's hand, expressing their relief at his recovery. "The rest of the board is on standby by video conference," Jake explained, setting up a laptop. "We thought it best to limit the number of people physically in the room." Once the video connection was established, showing the faces of 7 more board members on the screen, Richard Grayson called the meeting to order. "First, let me say how grateful we all are to see you recovering, Ethan. The past 2 months have been challenging for the company, but nothing compared to what you've been through." Ethan nodded acknowledgement. "Thank you, Richard. Now tell me exactly what my brother has done to my company." The board members exchanged glances. Howard Mendez cleared his throat. "Alexander used the power of attorney to insert himself as acting CEO. Initially, his actions seemed reasonable, maintaining operations, reassuring clients and partners. But over the past 3 weeks, things changed. He began pushing aggressively for a merger with Davis Enterprises, Richard continued. He presented financial projections claiming the company would face significant losses without the merger. Were those projections accurate? Ethan asked sharply. Howard shook his head. No, I reviewed them carefully. They were based on manipulated data, worst-case scenarios presented as likely outcomes. The real numbers? Ethan pressed. Stable, Howard. Confirmed. The new product line is performing well and the government contract you secured before your accident is proceeding on schedule. So there was never any legitimate business reason for the merger, Ethan concluded. None that I could see, Howard agreed. It would have devalued Thompson Technologies significantly while giving Davis control of our proprietary technology. And the board voted for this? Ethan couldn't keep the accusation from his voice. The vote was scheduled for yesterday, Richard clarified. Thanks to the court order and your interview, it never happened. Ethan's expression softened slightly. I apologize for my tone. I understand you were operating with manipulated information. We should have questioned Alexander's data more thoroughly, Richard admitted. For that, we owe you an apology. Ethan nodded acceptance of the apology, then got straight to business. Current status of the company? Stable but uncertain, Howard reported. Your interview last night reassured the market somewhat, but there are still concerns about leadership and direction. I'm naming Jake Reynolds as interim CEO, Ethan announced without preamble, effective immediately. Jake looked stunned. Ethan, I'm not sure that's... You've been my right hand for years, Ethan cut him off. You know the company inside and out. There's no one I trust more to protect my interests while I recover. The board members murmured among themselves, but Richard nodded approvingly. I think that's an excellent choice. Jake has always demonstrated both business acumen and personal integrity. All in favor? Ethan asked, looking at the video screen. The vote was unanimous. Jake looked both honored and overwhelmed. Next item, Ethan continued, his voice beginning to show signs of strain. Alexander Thompson is to be removed from all company roles and access immediately. His office is to be sealed, and his electronic access terminated. Again, the board voted unanimously in support. And finally, Ethan said, I want a full forensic audit of all company transactions during my absence. If my brother diverted funds or resources, I want to know. Already underway, Howard assured him. The preliminary findings should be available. By the end of the week, Dr. Morgan appeared at the door pointing to his watch. Sarah could see that Ethan was tiring, his face paler than when the meeting began. We've reached our time limit, gentlemen, she announced with a confidence that surprised even her. Dr. Morgan has been clear about Mr. Thompson's need for rest. The board members nodded respectfully and began to gather their materials. Richard paused before leaving. Ethan, I speak for the entire board when I say we're relieved to have you back. Take the time you need to recover fully. With Jake at the helm, the company is in good hands. After they left, Ethan sank back against the pillows, clearly exhausted, but satisfied. That went well, he murmured. You should rest now, Sarah urged, adjusting his pillows. Ethan caught her hand. Thank you for speaking up, for everything. His eyes were already closing as fatigue overtook him. Sarah sat quietly beside him as he slept, reflecting on the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been an invisible presence in this room, a cleaning lady reading to an unconscious man. Today, she had sat in on a board meeting of a multi-billion-dollar company at that same man's request. The door opened quietly, and Jake slipped back in. He looked at the sleeping Ethan, then at Sarah. He trusts you, Jake said simply. Ethan doesn't trust easily. I haven't done anything to earn that trust, Sarah replied. Jake smiled knowingly. Haven't you? You read to him when no one else bothered. You noticed his brother's suspicious behavior when everyone else looked the other way. You risked your job to protect someone who, at the time, couldn't even thank you. He paused. In Ethan's world, that kind of genuine care is rare. Sarah didn't know how to respond to that. Jake seemed to understand her discomfort. I just wanted to say thank you, he continued, and to let you know that if you need anything at all, you only have to ask. Ethan would want me to make sure you're taken care of. I don't need anything, Sarah said quickly. I was just doing the right thing. Jake nodded, respecting her modesty. Well, the offer stands, and I should warn you, once Ethan sets his mind on something, he can be pretty determined, and I think he's set his mind on keeping you in his life. With that, he left, leaving Sarah to ponder his words as Ethan slept peacefully beside her. The next few days fell into a new routine. Sarah arranged her work schedule to spend her breaks and off hours with Ethan. In the mornings, he had physical therapy, grueling sessions that left him frustrated with his body's weakness, but determined to push through. In the afternoons, he had brief business meetings, usually with Jake, who kept him updated on company matters. The forensic audit had uncovered troubling evidence that Alexander had indeed been funneling company resources to offshore accounts. Legal proceedings were underway to recover the funds and hold him accountable. Olivia had fled to Europe, according to the gossip columns, reportedly spotted in Monaco with a Russian billionaire. Ethan had shown no reaction when Jake shared this news, other than a wry comment about dodging a bullet. On the 5th day after Ethan's awakening, Dr. Morgan brought up the subject of discharge planning. "You're making remarkable progress," the doctor told Ethan during morning rounds. "Your cognitive function is essentially back to normal, and your physical strength is returning steadily. I think we can consider releasing you next week." "That's great news," Ethan said enthusiastically. However, Dr. Morgan continued, "You'll need continued rehabilitation and supervision. You won't be able to live alone immediately. Do you have family or friends who can stay with you? Or would you prefer to transition through a rehabilitation facility?" Ethan frowned. "I'm not going to a facility. Jake would help, but he's running the company now." He trailed off, thinking. "We'll figure something out," Sarah assured him, having just arrived for her morning visit before her shift. "Maybe a private nurse?" Dr. Morgan nodded. "That's certainly an option. We can arrange for home healthcare services." After the doctor left, Ethan seemed distracted, lost in thought. Sarah noticed his preoccupation. "What's wrong? I thought you'd be happy about going home soon." Ethan sighed. "I am. It's just going back to that empty house with all those rooms." He shook his head. "Before the accident, I never noticed how big and empty it was. Now the thought of rattling around in there alone during recovery is depressing." Sarah didn't know what to say. She couldn't really imagine the kind of home Ethan must have, something far beyond her modest apartment. "Maybe it's an opportunity to redecorate," she suggested lightly. "Make it feel more like a home?" Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. "Maybe it is." He reached for her hand, a gesture that had become familiar between them. "Sarah, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Her heart skipped a beat at his serious tone. "Yes?" "I've been thinking a lot about what happens when I leave here, about what I want my life to look like going forward." He took a deep breath. "The accident, the coma, they changed me. Or maybe they just made me see what was always there." Sarah waited, not sure where this was going. "I've spent years building a company, accumulating wealth, surrounding myself with people who only saw my money, not me." He squeezed her hand gently. "Then I wake up and find that the person who cared the most was someone who had nothing to gain from it." "Ethan, please let me finish," he said softly. "I know this might seem fast or strange, but I feel like we've known each other longer than just these few days. All those hours you spent reading to me, talking to me, I heard you. Not every word, but enough to know your heart." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I don't want to go back to an empty house with hired help," Ethan continued. "I want to go back to a home with someone who cares, someone like you." Sarah's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" "I'm asking if you would consider coming to work for me, officially, as my personal assistant during recovery. Good salary, flexible hours, and you could continue your nursing studies if you want." He smiled hopefully. "I know it's sudden, but yes," Sarah said, the word escaping before she could think it through. "Yes, I would like that." Ethan's face lit up with genuine happiness. "Really? You're sure?" Sarah nodded, her mind racing ahead. "I'd need to give notice here. Arrange things with my mother." "Whatever you need," Ethan assured her. "We can work out all the details. The important thing is that you'll be there." The joy in his eyes was unmistakable, and Sarah felt an answering warmth in her own heart. Was this really happening? Was she really about to leave her job as a hospital cleaner to work for Ethan Thompson? "There's one more thing," Ethan added, suddenly looking a bit uncertain. "The house has a separate guest suite with its own entrance. I thought maybe your mother could stay there. You mentioned her health issues, and I have a full home gym with equipment that could help with her physical therapy." Sarah was overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "Ethan, that's incredibly generous, but it's too much. It's not charity," he insisted. "It's practical. You'll be able to care for your mother and help me recover at the same time." Put that way, it did make sense, and the opportunity it would create for her mother's health and her own stalled career was too significant to dismiss out of hand. "I'll think about it," she promised, which was all she could honestly say at that moment. Ethan nodded, understanding her need for time. "That's all I ask." That evening, Sarah sat with her mother in their small apartment, explaining the unexpected job offer. "It sounds like an amazing opportunity," her mother said, studying Sarah's face carefully. "But you seem hesitant. Why?" Sarah sighed. "It's complicated. Ethan is. He's been through so much, and he's vulnerable right now. What if he's just attaching to me because I was there when he woke up? What if he changes his mind once he's fully recovered? That's a risk with any job," her mother pointed out. "But what's really bothering you, Sarah? Is it the job offer or is it your feelings for him?" Sarah looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" Her mother smiled knowingly. "Honey, you've talked about nothing but Ethan Thompson for weeks. Even before he woke up. You were always telling me about the books you were reading him, how unfair his family was treating him, and now your face lights up whenever you mention his name." "Mom, it's not like that," Sarah protested weakly. "Isn't it? There's nothing wrong with having feelings for him, Sarah. He sounds like a good man who recognizes your worth." "He's a billionaire," Sarah reminded her. "And I'm a cleaning lady." "You're a caring, intelligent woman who put her dreams on hold to help others," her mother corrected firmly. "Any man would be lucky to have you in his life, billionaire or not." Sarah couldn't help but smile at her mother's unwavering support. "So you think I should take the job?" "I think you should follow your heart," her mother replied. "And if your heart is leading you toward Ethan Thompson, I say go for it. Life doesn't give us many chances at something special. Don't let fear hold you back." The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital with a letter of resignation in her pocket and a mixture of nervousness and excitement in her heart. She found Ethan sitting up in a chair by the window, looking stronger than she had seen him yet. "Good morning," he greeted her with a warm smile. "You look different today." Sarah took a deep breath. "I've made a decision. I'll accept your job offer and the arrangement for my mother, at least on a trial basis." Ethan's face lit up with genuine happiness. "You won't regret it, Sarah. I promise." As they discussed the practical details of the arrangement, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what the future might hold. She was about to enter Ethan's world, a world of wealth and privilege she had only glimpsed from the outside. Would she find her place there? Could the connection they had formed in this hospital room survive in the real world? Only time would tell. But as she watched Ethan's face, animated with plans and possibilities, she felt a spark of hope that perhaps this unlikely friendship, or whatever it was becoming, might be the beginning of something truly meaningful for both of them. "So it's settled," Ethan said, reaching for her hand as he had so many times before. "Next week we both leave this hospital and start fresh." Sarah nodded, returning his gentle grip. "Next week," she agreed, taking the first step toward a future neither of them could have imagined 2 months ago when their paths first crossed in room 507. The day of Ethan's hospital discharge arrived with a flurry of activity. Dr. Morgan performed one final examination, reviewing the rehabilitation plan and medication schedule. A physical therapist demonstrated exercises Ethan would need to continue at home. Nurses came and went, bringing discharge papers and instructions. Through it all, Sarah remained a steady presence, taking notes and asking practical questions that Ethan, in his eagerness to leave, might have overlooked. "Are you sure you've got everything?" Sarah asked, checking the room one last time. Ethan smiled from the wheelchair the hospital required for discharge. "Honestly, there wasn't much to begin with. Jake brought fresh clothes and everything else I need is at home." Home. The word hung in the air between them, carrying different meanings for each of them. For Ethan, it was a sprawling mansion he hadn't seen in 2 months. For Sarah, it was about to become her new workplace and temporary residence. During the past week, preparations had been made. Jake had overseen the hiring of a housekeeper and cook. The guest suite had been prepared for Sarah's mother, complete with accessibility modifications for her comfort. Sarah had given notice at the hospital, packed up her small apartment, and tried to prepare herself for the dramatic change ahead. "The car is ready," Jake announced, entering the room. "Everything's set at the house." As they made their way through the hospital corridors, staff members stopped to wish Ethan well. Many seemed surprised to see Sarah by his side, not in her cleaning uniform, but in a simple blouse and slacks. "Good luck, Sarah," Nurse Jenkins called, giving her a knowing smile. "Don't be a stranger." Outside, a sleek black SUV waited at the curb. The driver, a serious-looking man in a suit, opened the door as they approached. "This is Marcus," Jake explained. "He'll be your driver and security, Ethan." "Security?" Sarah questioned, helping Ethan from the wheelchair to the car. "Standard precaution," Jake said casually, but his eyes conveyed more, especially given recent events. The ride to Ethan's home took nearly an hour, leaving the city behind for the exclusive suburbs where properties were measured in acres rather than square feet. Sarah watched the neighborhoods grow progressively more affluent, the houses larger and farther apart, until finally Marcus turned onto a private road flanked by tall iron gates. "Welcome to Thompson Estate," Jake announced. As the gates swung open automatically, Sarah couldn't hide her astonishment as they drove up a long, curved driveway. The house, mansion was more accurate, was a modern architectural masterpiece of stone, glass, and steel, set against a backdrop of manicured gardens and towering trees. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Ethan watched her reaction with a hint of uncertainty. "It's too much, isn't it?" "No," she assured him quickly. "It's just different from what I'm used to." He nodded, understanding. "It felt strange to me too at first. I grew up in a small apartment above my parents' hardware store. Sometimes I still wake up and wonder how I ended up here." This glimpse into his background surprised Sarah. She realized how little she actually knew about Ethan's life before the accident. The car stopped at the main entrance, where a small group of staff waited to welcome them. An elegant older woman stepped forward as Marcus opened the car door. "Welcome home, Mr. Thompson," she said warmly. "I'm Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper. We're all so pleased to have you back." Ethan shook her hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Winters. This is Sarah Miller. She'll be staying here as my personal assistant during my recovery." If Mrs. Winters had any thoughts about this arrangement, her professional demeanor revealed nothing. "Of course, sir. Ms. Miller's suite has been prepared and we've made the modifications for her mother as requested." A tour of the house followed, though abbreviated due to Ethan's limited stamina. The main floor featured a grand foyer with soaring ceilings, a formal living room, dining room, library, and a state-of-the-art kitchen where the chef, Miguel, was preparing dinner. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered stunning views of the gardens and the distant ocean. "Your bedroom suite is on this floor," Jake explained to Ethan. "We thought it would be easier than dealing with stairs during your recovery." The master suite was larger than Sarah's entire apartment, with a sitting area, massive bathroom, and doors leading to a private terrace. The decor was surprisingly understated: clean lines, neutral colors, and minimal ornamentation. "And now, Sarah's accommodations," Jake continued, leading them down a hallway to a separate wing of the house. The guest suite took Sarah's breath away. It consisted of a comfortable living room, 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and a bathroom that could easily accommodate her mother's mobility needs. Large windows overlooked a private garden. "This isn't a guest suite," she protested weakly. "It's a luxury apartment." Ethan smiled at her reaction. "Is it suitable? We can make any changes you'd like." "It's perfect," Sarah assured him, still trying to absorb the reality of her new surroundings. "More than perfect. Your mother arrives tomorrow?" Jake asked. Sarah nodded. "Yes, a medical transport service is bringing her in the morning. I'll make sure everything is ready," Jake promised. "Now, Ethan, I think you should rest before dinner. Doctor's orders." Ethan didn't argue, a sign of how tired he truly was, despite his efforts to hide it. As Jake helped him to his room, Sarah remained in the guest suite, trying to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. Just 2 months ago, she had been a hospital cleaner, struggling to make ends meet. Now she was standing in a mansion, about to begin a job she had never trained for, caring for a man whose life was as different from hers as could be imagined. "What am I doing here?" she whispered to the empty room. Doubt and anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. Was this a mistake? Was she out of her depth? What if she failed at this job? What if Ethan regretted hiring her once he was back in his normal environment? A soft knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Mrs. Winters stood there with a tea tray. "I thought you might like some refreshment, Ms. Miller," the housekeeper said, setting the tray on a coffee table. "The first day in a new place can be overwhelming," Sarah smiled gratefully. "Thank you, and please call me Sarah." Mrs. Winters poured the tea with practiced precision. "Very well, Sarah. May I speak frankly?" "Of course." The older woman's expression softened. "I've worked for Mr. Thompson since he purchased this house 5 years ago. In that time, I've seen many people come through these doors. Business associates, friends, his brother, and of course, Ms. Rothschild." Sarah tensed slightly at the mention of Olivia. "In all that time," Mrs. Winters continued, "I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "Mrs. Winters, it's not like that. I'm just here to help with his recovery." The housekeeper smiled knowingly. "Perhaps, but I believe you've already helped him recover something far more important than his physical health." She stood to leave. "Dinner will be served at 7. Please let me know if you need anything at all." After Mrs. Winters left, Sarah sipped her tea, reflecting on the housekeeper's words. Was she right? Did Ethan see her as more than an employee, more than a caregiver? And if so, how did she feel about that? Her feelings for Ethan were complicated. She admired his strength and determination. She felt protective of him after witnessing his vulnerability. There was an undeniable connection between them that had formed during those quiet nights when she read to him, a connection that had only strengthened since he awoke. But was it real? Or was it born from extraordinary circumstances that wouldn't survive in normal life? Sarah didn't have answers to these questions yet. For now, she had a job to do, helping Ethan recover fully and regain his independence. The rest would have to sort itself out with time. That evening, she joined Ethan for dinner in a smaller, more intimate dining room than the formal one she'd seen on the tour. He was already seated when she arrived, looking more relaxed in casual clothes than he had in the hospital. "I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost," he teased. "It took me a week to stop getting lost in this place when I first moved in." Sarah smiled as she took her seat across from him. "It is rather maze-like. I might need breadcrumbs to find my way back to my room." Miguel served a simple but elegant meal, adapted to Ethan's dietary needs during recovery. The conversation flowed easily as they ate, touching on light topics. Books they'd both read, films they'd enjoyed, places they'd visited. "I've barely left New York," Sarah admitted when Ethan mentioned a business trip to Tokyo. "The farthest I've been is my grandmother's house in Vermont." "Vermont is beautiful," Ethan said sincerely. "Sometimes I think I'd trade all my trips to glamorous cities for more time in peaceful places like that." "You could go anytime you wanted," Sarah pointed out. "That's one advantage of your position." Ethan's expression grew thoughtful. "True, but somehow work always seemed more important." He shook his head slightly. The accident changed that perspective. 2 months in darkness gives a man time to reconsider his priorities. "And what are your priorities now?" Sarah asked softly. Ethan met her gaze directly. "Health, peace, genuine connections with people who see me, not my bank account." He hesitated, then added, "People like you." The moment hung between them, filled with unspoken questions and possibilities. Sarah felt her heart quicken, but didn't know how to respond. Ethan seemed to sense her uncertainty. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable. It's just being here with you, having a normal conversation over dinner, feels more real than anything in my life before the accident." "I understand," Sarah said, and she did. The connection between them was undeniable, whatever its nature might be. The remainder of the evening passed pleasantly, with Ethan showing surprising stamina for his first day home. After dinner, they moved to a comfortable sitting room where he showed her his collection of first edition books. These were my first real indulgence when the company started making serious money, he confessed, carefully opening a leather-bound volume. I always loved reading, but growing up our books came from the library or yard sales. Sarah thought about the paperback library books she had read to him in the hospital, so different from these valuable collector's items. Yet another reminder of the different worlds they came from. Eventually, Ethan's energy began to flag, and Sarah insisted he retire for the night. She helped him to his room, where a nurse was waiting to assist with his evening medical routine. "You've had a big day," she said as she prepared to leave him in the nurse's care. "Don't push too hard too fast." Ethan caught her hand, a gesture that had become familiar between them. "Thank you for being here, Sarah, for making this house feel like a home again." She squeezed his hand gently before releasing it. "Good night, Ethan. I'll see you in the morning." Back in her suite, Sarah called her mother to check in and confirm the arrangements for the next day. After hanging up, she stepped out onto her private patio, breathing in the cool night air. The gardens were beautiful in the moonlight, peaceful, in a way she hadn't expected such a grand estate could be. She thought about Ethan's words, about making the house feel like a home. Had she done that simply by being here? And what did it mean that he felt that way after just one day? Sarah didn't have answers, but as she gazed up at the star-filled sky, she felt a sense of possibility she hadn't experienced in years. Whatever happened next, she was grateful for this unexpected chance to help someone who, against all odds, had come to matter to her deeply. The next morning, Sarah was up early, wanting to be prepared for her mother's arrival. She found Mrs. Winters already in the kitchen, supervising the preparation of breakfast. "Good morning, Sarah," the housekeeper greeted her warmly. "Did you sleep well?" "Surprisingly, yes," Sarah admitted. "Is Mr. Thompson awake yet?" "Not yet. The night nurse reports he slept well but should probably rest a bit longer. I was about to bring you breakfast in your suite, but since you're here, I can eat in the kitchen," Sarah said quickly, not wanting to create extra work. "I'm used to that," Mrs. Winters smiled. "As you wish. Miguel has prepared several options. Over a simple breakfast of fresh fruit and yogurt, Sarah discussed her mother's arrival with Mrs. Winters, making sure everything was in place. The medical transport was scheduled for 10 a.m., and Sarah was both excited and nervous about her mother's reaction to their new living situation. "Do you think your mother will be comfortable here?" Mrs. Winters asked perceptively. Sarah considered the question. "It will be an adjustment. She's a very independent person despite her health issues. I'm a bit worried she'll feel, I don't know, like a charity case." "Perhaps you could involve her in some aspect of the household," Mrs. Winters suggested. "When people contribute, they feel more like participants than recipients." "That's a wonderful idea," Sarah said gratefully. "My mother used to be an excellent gardener before she got sick. Maybe she could advise on the gardens or indoor plants." "We would welcome her expertise," Mrs. Winters assured her. "The gardener, Mr. Chen, is always open to suggestions." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake, looking fresh and businesslike in a tailored suit. "Good morning," he greeted them. "Sarah, I wanted to catch you before I head to the office. The security team will be here in about an hour for a briefing. I'd like you to attend." "Security briefing?" Sarah echoed, confused. "Why would I need to be there?" Jake's expression turned serious. "There have been some developments regarding Alexander. The forensic audit revealed even more financial impropriety than we initially suspected, and criminal charges are being considered. He's made some threats." Sarah felt a chill. "Threats against Ethan? Nothing specific, but concerning enough that we're increasing security. As someone close to Ethan, you should be aware of the protocols." The implication that she might also be at risk was unsettling. "I understand. I'll be there." After Jake left, Sarah finished her breakfast quickly, her mind now preoccupied with this new concern. She had been so focused on Ethan's physical recovery that she hadn't fully considered the ongoing threat his brother might pose. The security briefing was thorough and sobering. The head of the security team, a former military man named Davis, explained the enhanced measures being implemented around the property: additional guards, upgraded surveillance systems, and strict protocols for visitors. "Ms. Miller, You and your mother will each be given panic buttons to carry at all times, Davis explained. These connect directly to our security center, which is staffed 24/7. Sarah nodded, trying to absorb the reality that such precautions were necessary. Do you really think Alexander would try to harm Ethan physically? Davis's expression was neutral. We prepare for all contingencies, ma'am. Mr. Alexander Thompson has lost a significant amount of money and status. People in that situation can become unpredictable. The briefing concluded just as Ethan entered the room, moving slowly with the aid of a walking cane, but looking rested and determined. Sorry I missed the beginning, he said, easing himself into a chair. Sarah, are you okay with all this? She composed herself quickly. Yes, of course, it's just a lot to take in. I know, he acknowledged. If you're having second thoughts about staying here, I'm not, she assured him firmly. I just want to make sure my mother will feel safe. We'll take every precaution. For both of you, Davis promised. The estate is already one of the most secure private residences in the state. After the security team departed, Ethan reached for Sarah's hand. I'm sorry about all this. I should have warned you that things might get complicated. It's fine, she said, though her mind was racing with new worries. My mother will be here soon. I should get ready. Ethan nodded, releasing her hand. Of course, I'd like to welcome her when she arrives, if that's all right. She'd like that, Sarah said, touched by his thoughtfulness. Margaret Miller arrived precisely at 10 a.m., transported by a medical service that helped her from the van to a wheelchair. Despite her physical limitations, she carried herself with dignity, her grey-streaked hair neatly styled and her clothes simple but well kept. Sarah rushed to greet her, bending to embrace her mother tightly. Mom, how was the trip? Are you comfortable? Do you need anything? Margaret laughed softly. Slow down, dear, I'm fine. The ride was very comfortable, much better than that awful bus we usually take. Ethan approached slowly, leaning on his cane. Mrs. Miller, welcome to my home. I'm Ethan Thompson. Margaret studied him with clear, intelligent eyes. So you're the young man my daughter has been talking about for weeks. It's good to finally meet you, Mr. Thompson. Please call me Ethan, he said, offering his hand. Sarah has told me so much about you. I'm grateful you agreed to stay here. During her employment, well, how could I refuse when my daughter was so excited about this opportunity? Margaret's gaze moved from Ethan to the house behind him. My goodness, when Sarah described a big house, I wasn't expecting a palace. Ethan laughed, a genuine sound that Sarah realized she hadn't heard often enough. It's a bit much, isn't it? I hope you'll find your suite comfortable, though. Sarah mentioned you enjoy gardening, and there's a lovely view of the rose garden from your windows. Margaret's eyes lit up. Roses? I used to grow award-winning hybrid teas before my illness. Then you must meet Mr. Chen, our gardener. He's been struggling with black spot on some of the heritage varieties. As they moved inside, Sarah watched, in amazement as her mother and Ethan fell into an easy conversation about roses and gardening. Her mother, normally reserved with strangers, seemed completely at ease with the billionaire, discussing soil pH and fungal treatments as if they were old friends. The tour of Margaret's accommodations went similarly well. Her eyes widened at the accessible bathroom with its specially designed fixtures, but she made no comment on the obvious expense that had gone into the modifications. This will do nicely, was all she said, but Sarah could see her mother was pleased. After lunch, Margaret needed to rest, and Sarah helped her settle into her new bedroom. Once her mother was comfortable, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed. So what do you really think? She asked anxiously. Is it too overwhelming? Be honest, Mom. Margaret patted her daughter's hand. It's certainly grander than anywhere I've ever lived, but that's not what matters. She looked thoughtfully at Sarah. What matters is that young man out there who has gone to such lengths to make us comfortable. He's very considerate, Sarah agreed. He's more than that, Sarah. I've seen how he looks at you and how you look at him when you think no one notices. Sarah felt her cheeks warm. Mom, please, it's not like that. Margaret raised an eyebrow skeptically. Isn't it? I may be old, but I'm not blind. There's something special happening between you two. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I'm going to do my job, Sarah said firmly. Help him recover, get back on his feet. That's what he hired me for. And then, Sarah hesitated. And then I'll see about finishing nursing school like we planned. Margaret studied her daughter's face. Plans can change, Sarah. Sometimes life offers us unexpected paths. Don't be afraid to follow one if it feels right. Later that afternoon, Sarah found Ethan in his home office, reviewing documents with Jake. They both looked up when she entered. "Sorry to interrupt," she said. "I just wanted to let you know my mother is settled in and resting comfortably." "You're not interrupting," Ethan assured her. "In fact, we were just discussing something that concerns you." Sarah tensed. "Oh?" Jake gathered his papers. "I'll leave you two to talk. Sarah, good to see your mother arrived safely." After Jake left, Ethan gestured for Sarah to sit in the chair across from his desk. "I've been thinking about your future," he began. "My future?" Sarah asked, suddenly nervous. "You mentioned that you had to leave nursing school when your mother got sick. I'd like to help you go back." Sarah stared at him. "What do you mean? I've looked into programs at several nursing schools in the area. You could start as early as the next semester. Your schedule here would be adjusted to accommodate your classes." "Ethan, I can't accept—" "It's not charity," he interrupted gently. "It's an investment in someone with tremendous potential, and it's entirely selfish on my part." "Selfish? How?" His expression softened. "Because I want you in my life, Sarah, in whatever capacity makes you happy. If that means supporting your education so you can fulfill your dreams, then that's what I want to do." Sarah was speechless. The offer was incredibly generous, but it was the sentiment behind it that truly took her breath away. He wanted her in his life, not as an employee or a caregiver, but as someone who mattered to him personally. "Don't know what to say," she finally managed. "Say you'll think about it," Ethan suggested. "That's all I ask." Sarah nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." As she left the office, her mind was reeling. First the job, then the accommodations for her mother, and now an offer to pay for her education. It was all happening so fast, so far, beyond anything she could have imagined when she first entered room 507 as a cleaning lady all those weeks ago. Was her mother right? Was there something special happening between her and Ethan? And if there was, where could it possibly lead, given the vast differences in their lives and backgrounds? She had no answers yet, but as she walked through the grand hallways of what was now, temporarily at least, her home, Sarah felt both terrified and exhilarated by the possibilities that lay ahead. The first week at Thompson Estate established a new routine. Ethan's days were structured around physical therapy sessions, medical checkups, and brief business meetings. Sarah coordinated his schedule, managed his medications, and provided support during his exercises. Margaret Miller, to everyone's surprise, blossomed in her new environment. After just 2 days of rest, she asked to see the gardens. Mr. Chen, the elderly gardener, was initially skeptical of her suggestions regarding the troubled rose bushes, but when her first recommendation produced visible improvement, a respectful partnership was born. "Your mother has quite a gift," Ethan remarked to Sarah, as they watched Margaret and Mr. Chen in animated discussion over a particularly stubborn climbing rose. They were sitting on the terrace, enjoying the afternoon sunshine. After Ethan's therapy session, "She used to be the go-to person for gardening advice in our neighborhood," Sarah said proudly. "Before she got sick, she could make anything grow. It's wonderful to see her passionate about something again." Ethan smiled, looking more relaxed than Sarah had ever seen him. "I'm glad she's comfortable here." "More than comfortable," Sarah agreed. "She told me this morning that she'd forgotten how good it feels to be useful." "Everyone needs purpose," Ethan said thoughtfully. "That's something money can't buy." Sarah studied his face. "Have you thought about what your purpose will be? Once you're fully recovered, I mean." "I've been thinking about little else," he admitted. "The company will always be important to me. I built it from nothing, and it employs thousands of people. But I don't think I want to return to 16-hour days and international meetings." "What would you rather do?" Ethan's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I've been talking with Jake about restructuring, creating a charitable foundation that would focus on medical research and patient support, especially for those who don't have access to quality care, the kind of care that saved my life." That sounds wonderful, Sarah said sincerely. I'd like you to be part of it, Ethan continued, watching her face carefully. Your experience, your compassion, they would be invaluable. Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Winters appeared on the terrace. Mr. Thompson, Mr. Reynolds has arrived. He says it's urgent. Ethan frowned. Please send him out, Mrs. Winters. And perhaps some refreshments. Jake emerged moments later, his normally relaxed demeanor replaced by obvious tension. He nodded a greeting to Sarah before turning to Ethan. We have a situation, he said without preamble. Ethan straightened in his chair. Tell me. Alexander is fighting back. His lawyers have filed a motion claiming that your cognitive abilities are compromised by the brain injury, rendering you unfit to make business decisions. Jake handed Ethan a folder. They're demanding an independent neurological evaluation and temporary conservatorship over your personal and business affairs, with Alexander as conservator, of course. That's ridiculous, Sarah exclaimed. Dr. Morgan has confirmed Ethan's cognitive recovery is nearly complete. Jake nodded grimly. Yes, but Alexander's team is arguing that Dr. Morgan is biased because of his personal relationship with Ethan. As his treating physician, they're insisting on their own experts. Ethan remained calm, though Sarah could see the muscle in his jaw twitching with suppressed anger. Anything else? Yes, Jake said hesitantly. They've subpoenaed Sarah. What? Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Why would they want me to testify? They're claiming your relationship with Ethan is inappropriate, that you've used undue influence over him during a vulnerable period, and that your presence here is evidence of his impaired judgment. Ethan's hand clenched into a fist. That's absurd. Sarah saved me, helped expose Alexander's plan to steal my company, which is exactly why he's targeting her, Jake pointed out. She's a threat to him, and he's trying to discredit both of you at once. Sarah felt sick. So he's saying I'm manipulating Ethan, taking advantage of him. Essentially, yes. Jake's expression was apologetic. And given your current living and employment arrangement, it looks suspicious, Sarah finished, her voice hollow. The implication was clear. A former cleaning lady now living in a billionaire's mansion after he woke from a coma could easily be painted as an opportunist. This is my fault, Ethan said angrily. I should have anticipated Alexander would stoop this low. Sarah stood abruptly. I should go. If I'm not here, he can't make these accusations. No, Ethan said firmly, reaching for her hand. That's exactly what he wants. You've done nothing wrong, Sarah. We've done nothing wrong. But the appearance... I don't care about appearances, Ethan interrupted. I care about the truth. And the truth is that you saved me in every way that matters. I'm not going to let Alexander drive you away. Jake cleared his throat. There's more. Alexander is also attempting to freeze Ethan's personal accounts pending the evaluation, claiming he may be squandering assets due to cognitive impairment, specifically referencing the accommodations provided for Sarah and her mother. He's trying to cut me off financially, Ethan realized. Make me vulnerable. Brian anticipated this, Jake assured him. We've already established a separate trust that can't be touched by these proceedings. Your immediate finances are secure. Sarah listened to the exchange with growing distress. This legal battle was escalating rapidly, and somehow she had become a central figure in it. Alexander was using her presence to attack Ethan, attempting to portray her as an exploitative gold digger, and Ethan as a brain-damaged victim incapable of seeing through her manipulation. What do we do? She asked quietly. Jake looked to Ethan, who seemed deep in thought. We fight, Ethan said finally. We agreed to the independent evaluation. I have nothing to hide. My cognitive function is fine, and any legitimate expert will confirm that. And the allegations about Sarah? Jake pressed. Ethan's expression hardened. We address those head-on. Sarah's employment here is above board, with a formal contract, reasonable compensation, and clear duties. Her mother's presence can be justified by practical considerations for Sarah's ability to perform her job while managing her mother's care. What about your personal relationship? Jake asked carefully. Alexander's lawyers will certainly explore that angle. Sarah felt her cheeks burn. There is no personal relationship, she said quickly. I'm Ethan's employee and friend, nothing more. Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, hurt disappointment, but it was gone too quickly for Sarah to be sure. Sarah's, "Right," he said evenly. "Our relationship is professional and appropriate. Alexander can insinuate whatever he wants, but he can't prove what doesn't exist." The words stung, though Sarah knew they were necessary. Of course, they had to present their relationship as strictly professional. Anything else would only fuel Alexander's accusations. "I'll have Brian prepare you both for your depositions," Jake said. "Alexander's lawyers will be aggressive. They'll try to twist your words, make you contradict each other." "We'll be ready," Ethan assured him. Though Sarah wasn't nearly as confident, after Jake left, an uncomfortable silence fell between them. Sarah moved to the edge of the terrace, watching her mother in the garden below, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around them. "I'm sorry," Ethan said finally, coming to stand beside her. "I never wanted to put you in this position." "It's not your fault," Sarah replied, though she couldn't look at him. "Alexander is the one doing this. Still, I feel responsible." He hesitated. "If you want to leave, I would understand. I could arrange for your mother's care elsewhere. Make sure you're both provided for." Sarah turned to him then, surprised by the offer. "Is that what you want, for me to leave?" "No," he said immediately, with such conviction that Sarah's breath caught. "That's the last thing I want, but I need you to know that you have options, that you're not trapped here because of my battle with Alexander." "I don't feel trapped," Sarah assured him. "I'm here because I want to be. Alexander isn't going to scare me away." Ethan's relief was visible. "Thank you," he said softly. "I don't think I could face this without you." The moment was interrupted by Mrs. Winters, who appeared at the terrace door. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson. There's a delivery for Ms. Miller." Sarah frowned, confused. "For me? I'm not expecting anything." Mrs. Winters handed her a small envelope. It was hand-delivered to the gate. Security checked it for safety. Sarah opened the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. As she read the typed message, the color drained from her face. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it? What's wrong?" Sarah handed him the note with trembling fingers. It was brief and to the point. "I know all about you, Sarah Miller. Your past, your secrets. Leave Thompson now or everyone else will know too. This is your only warning." "Alexander," Ethan growled, his face darkening with anger. "This is how he operates. Threats and intimidation." Sarah shook her head, bewildered. "But I don't have any secrets. My life is an open book." "He's bluffing," Ethan assured her, "trying to scare you away because he knows you're a threat to his plans." Despite his reassurance, Sarah felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had always lived a simple, honest life. But everyone had moments they weren't proud of, things they wouldn't want publicly scrutinized. "Davis needs to see this," Ethan said, referring to the head of security, "and we should inform the police. This is harassment, possibly blackmail." Sarah nodded absently, her mind racing. What could Alexander possibly think he knew about her? And would he really expose it publicly, just to get her away from Ethan? The incident cast a shadow over the remainder of the day. Security around the estate was increased, and Davis insisted on assigning a personal guard to accompany Sarah if she left the property. That evening, Sarah was unusually quiet during dinner, picking at her food without appetite. Her mother noticed immediately. "You're worried about something," Margaret observed after Ethan had excused himself to take a business call. "Is it the legal situation Jake mentioned earlier?" Sarah had given her mother a simplified version of Alexander's legal challenge, without mentioning the threatening note. "Partly," she admitted. "It's getting complicated." Margaret studied her daughter's face. "There's more to it than that. Something's frightened you." Sarah hesitated, then decided her mother deserved to know the full situation. She retrieved the note from her pocket and handed it to Margaret. "This was delivered today," she explained. "Ethan thinks his brother is behind it." Margaret read the note, her expression hardening. "Empty threats," she said firmly, handing it back. "You have nothing to hide, Sarah. That's what I told Ethan, but it still feels invasive, like someone's looking into my past, twisting things." "What could they possibly find?" Margaret asked. "Reasonably. That you worked hard your whole life, that you gave up your education to care for your sick mother." that you read to a coma patient when no one else bothered. If those are your secrets, I'd say you're in good shape, Sarah smiled weakly. You always know how to put things in perspective. It's a mother's job, Margaret replied, then hesitated. There is one thing, though. Something that might come up if someone is really digging. Sarah looked at her mother curiously. What do you mean? Your father, Margaret said quietly. You were so young when he left, you probably don't remember the circumstances clearly. I know he abandoned us, Sarah said, a familiar hurt coloring her words. What else matters? Margaret sighed. It wasn't quite that simple. Your father had problems, gambling mainly. He got involved with some dangerous people, borrowed money he couldn't repay. What are you saying? When he left, it wasn't just because he wanted out of our lives. He was running from debts, from threats. He thought we'd be safer without him. Around? Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. I never told you because I wanted to protect you from that part of our past. He wasn't a good husband or father, but he wasn't the monster I sometimes let you believe he was. Sarah absorbed this revelation in silence. Her father had been little more than a shadow in her life, a name she rarely spoke. She had built her identity around being the daughter of a strong single mother, not the abandoned child of a gambling addict. I don't see how this could matter now, she said finally. It was over 20 years ago. Probably it doesn't, Margaret agreed. But if someone is looking for ways to hurt you or discredit you, family history can be a vulnerable point. I just wanted you to hear the truth from me first. Sarah nodded, appreciating her mother's honesty, while wondering if there were other parts of her life that could be twisted against her. She hadn't dated much, focusing instead on work and her mother's care. There were no scandalous ex-boyfriends, no wild college years, no criminal record. Her life had been remarkably straightforward. Thank you for telling me, she said, squeezing her mother's hand. But I still don't think I have any secrets worth threatening me over. Of course you don't, Margaret said confidently, which is why you shouldn't let this intimidate you. If Ethan Thompson is worth fighting for, then fight. He's my employer, Mom, Sarah reminded her, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Margaret raised an eyebrow skeptically but didn't push further. Well, whatever he is to you, don't let threats drive you away from something that matters. Later that night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept turning her mother's words over in her mind. If Ethan Thompson is worth fighting for, then fight. Was that what she was doing? Fighting for Ethan? She got up and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens. Somewhere beyond the property's borders, Alexander Thompson was plotting his next move, determined to separate her from Ethan. Why did it matter so much to him? Did he really see her as a threat, or was this just another way to hurt his brother? A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, leaning on his cane. I'm sorry to disturb you so late, he said. I saw your light was on from the garden. Is everything okay? She asked, concerned by his unexpected appearance. I couldn't sleep, he admitted. I kept thinking about that note, about what Alexander might try next. He hesitated. May I come in for a moment? Sarah stepped back, allowing him into the small sitting area of her suite. They sat across from each other, the late hour and private setting creating an intimacy that made Sarah acutely aware of their solitude. I've been thinking, Ethan began, his expression serious, about your safety, about this situation we're in. And, Sarah prompted when he paused, and I think we need to be strategic. Alexander is trying to drive a wedge between us because he sees our connection as a threat. He thinks if he can separate you from me, I'll be more vulnerable. Is he right? Sarah asked quietly. Ethan met her gaze directly. Yes, he said simply. I am stronger with you than without you. You've given me something to fight for beyond just my company or my wealth. He took a deep breath. But that doesn't mean you have to stay in the line of fire. What are you suggesting? I've arranged for a safe house, he explained, a place where you and your mother could stay until this is resolved. You'd have security, privacy, all the comforts you need. Alexander wouldn't be able to find you, threaten. To you, Sarah felt a flicker of disappointment. You want me to hide? I want you to be safe, Ethan corrected gently. These legal battles can get ugly. Alexander will stop at nothing to win. And if I leave, what happens to you? To your recovery? I'll manage. Jake can hire additional staff to cover your duties. Sarah stood, moving to the window again to hide the hurt in her eyes. So I'm replaceable after all. Ethan rose and came to stand behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. Never, he said, his voice low and intense. You are irreplaceable, Sarah. That's why I need to know you're safe. She turned to face him, suddenly very aware of how little space separated them. I don't want to hide, she said firmly. I want to stand with you and fight. Alexander's threats don't scare me. They scare me, Ethan admitted. The thought of him hurting you in any way. He didn't finish the sentence, but the emotion in his eyes said everything his words didn't. Ethan, Sarah said softly, why does it matter so much to you what happens to me? The question hung between them, laden with meaning. Ethan's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. I think you know why, he said, quietly. The moment stretched, taut with possibility. Sarah knew they were standing at a crossroads. If she stepped forward, if she acknowledged the feelings growing between them, everything would change. The careful boundaries they had maintained would dissolve, giving Alexander exactly the ammunition he needed against them. But if she stepped back, denied what they both clearly felt, would she regret it forever? We can't, she whispered. Though she made no move to increase the distance between them, Alexander would use it against you, say I manipulated you, that your judgment is compromised. I don't care, Ethan said, raising a hand to gently touch her cheek. Some things are worth the risk. The warmth of his palm against her skin sent a shiver through Sarah. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to imagine what it would be like to give in to these feelings, to let down the professional barriers she had so carefully maintained. It would complicate everything, she said, opening her eyes to find him watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. The legal case, my position here, yes, Ethan agreed, it would. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. But pretending these feelings don't exist is already complicating things. At least if we're honest with each other, we can face whatever comes together. Sarah knew he was right. The tension between them, the careful avoidance of acknowledging their deepening connection, was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Every shared look, every casual touch, carried meaning they both pretended not to see. I'm afraid, she admitted in a whisper. Not of Alexander or his threats. I'm afraid of what happens if this doesn't work. I've built a life here with you, and my mother. If I lose that, you won't lose it, Ethan promised. Whatever happens between us, I will always make sure you and your mother are secure. That's not what I mean, Sarah said, finding the courage to be completely honest. I'm not worried about financial security. I'm worried about losing you, this connection we have. It means more to me than I can say. Ethan's eyes softened. Then, trust it, he urged. Trust us. As he leaned forward, Sarah made her decision. She met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepening with shared emotion. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while her hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying herself as the world seemed to shift beneath her feet. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the first day I opened my eyes and saw you, he confessed. Sarah smiled, joy bubbling up despite all the complications this new development would bring. I think I've wanted it just as long, she admitted. Ethan stepped back slightly, though he kept hold of her hands. So where does this leave us? Still employer and employee, friends, something more? I don't know, Sarah answered honestly. But I think we need to figure it out before we face Alexander's lawyers. They'll ask about our relationship, and I don't want to lie. Ethan nodded, suddenly serious again. You're right. We need to be strategic about this. He thought for a moment. What if you resigned as my personal assistant, formally ended the employment relationship? And then what? I'd still be living in your house. As my guest, Ethan suggested. Or better yet, as a tenant. We could draw up a rental agreement for your suite. You could pay nominal rent from the money you've already earned working here. Sarah considered the idea. It would create some distance between her position in the household and her personal relationship with Ethan. That might work. But what about my mother? The same arrangement could apply to her, and her gardening consultation could be formalized with a small stipend. He smiled slightly. Mr. Chen would probably insist on it anyway. He's been raving about her expertise with the roses. The practical solutions helped ease some of Sarah's anxiety. They couldn't change the fact that Alexander would use their relationship against them, but they could at least ensure their arrangements were above reproach. There's one more thing, Ethan added, his expression growing serious again. Your safety is still my primary concern. If Alexander escalates his threats, will you at least consider moving to the safe house temporarily? Sarah nodded reluctantly. I'll consider it, but only if things get significantly worse. I meant what I said about standing with you, Ethan. We face this together. He squeezed her hands gratefully. Together, he agreed, as Ethan left her suite a few minutes later. Sarah felt both exhilarated and apprehensive. Their relationship had just taken a momentous turn, adding a new layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Alexander would certainly use it against them, painting her as a manipulative gold digger and Ethan as cognitively impaired for falling for her. But as she returned to bed, Sarah found that the prospect of facing Alexander's accusations no longer frightened her as it had before. Whatever came next, she and Ethan would confront it as a united front. The connection between them, born in the quiet hours of room 507 and strengthened through crisis and recovery, had just proved itself stronger than fear or intimidation. Outside the Thompson estate, in a luxury hotel suite across town, Alexander Thompson sat at his desk, reviewing the dossier his private investigator had compiled on Sarah Miller. Most of it was disappointingly mundane. Her work history, education, financial struggles, her mother's medical issues. But there, on the last page, was a detail that made him smile coldly. A connection to Ethan's past that even Ethan himself didn't know existed. A connection that, when revealed, would raise serious questions about Sarah's true motivations for entering his brother's life. Got you, Alexander murmured, picking up his phone to call his lawyer. This was the ammunition he needed, the perfect weapon to destroy Sarah's credibility and prove Ethan's judgment was fatally compromised. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The morning after their first kiss, Sarah woke with a mix of emotions. Joy at the new understanding between her and Ethan, worry about Alexander's threats, and uncertainty about what came next. She had barely finished dressing when her phone rang. It was Jake. "Sarah, I need you to come to Ethan's office right away," he said, his voice tense. "Something's happened." Her stomach dropped. "Is Ethan okay?" "He's fine, but we have a situation. Just get here as soon as you can." Sarah hurried to Ethan's home office, finding him and Jake bent over a laptop, expressions grim. Ethan looked up when she entered, his face softening momentarily before returning to concern. "What's going on?" she asked. Jake turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a gossip website with the headline, "Billionaire's Bedside Romance. Brain-damaged CEO falls for hospital cleaner." Below was a photo of Sarah entering the Thompson estate, alongside an older picture of Ethan from a business magazine. "It started," Jake said grimly. "Alexander's media campaign." Sarah scanned the article, her face burning with humiliation. It portrayed her as a scheming opportunist who had seduced her way into the vulnerable billionaire's life and home. There were quotes from inside sources claiming she had deliberately pursued Ethan while he was at his most vulnerable. "This says horrible," she whispered, sinking into a chair. "They make me sound like some kind of predator." Ethan moved to her side, his hand finding hers. "It's tabloid garbage. No one who knows you would believe it." "But most people don't know me," Sarah pointed out. "They'll see this and think I'm using you." "We anticipated something like this," Jake reminded them. "Alexander is trying to shape public opinion before the competency hearing. He wants to present Sarah as evidence of Ethan's impaired judgment." "There's more," Ethan said reluctantly. My PR team says several other outlets have received tips about our relationship. They're holding off publishing for now, seeking comment from us first, but it won't be long before this spreads. What do we do? Sarah asked, struggling to keep her composure. Jake leaned forward. We have two options. We can ignore it, refuse to dignify it with a response, or we can get ahead of the story, control the narrative ourselves. How would we do that? Sarah asked. An exclusive interview with a respected outlet, Jake suggested. Present your actual relationship, explain how you met, how Sarah helped expose Alexander's conspiracy. Make it clear that Ethan's cognitive function is completely intact and that his decisions are sound. That would mean publicly acknowledging our personal relationship, Ethan noted, looking at Sarah. Are you ready for that level of scrutiny? Sarah hesitated. The thought of cameras, interviews, having her life examined by strangers, it was terrifying. But the alternative, hiding, letting Alexander control the narrative, seemed worse. I have nothing to hide, she said finally. If telling our story will help stop Alexander, then we should do it. Ethan squeezed her hand gratefully. Let's do it right then. No gossip shows or tabloids. A serious journalist, someone with credibility. I have the perfect person in mind, Jake said. Elizabeth Chen from Business Weekly. She's tough but fair, and she's been covering corporate governance issues for years. She'd understand the stakes. As they discussed logistics, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Have you seen the article? Don't worry, we've weathered worse storms. Sarah excused herself to call her mother. Mom, I'm so sorry you got dragged into this mess. Nonsense, Margaret replied firmly. I've been called worse than the cleaner's invalid mother in my time. I'm more concerned about you. Are you all right? I'm coping, Sarah admitted. Ethan and Jake want to do an interview. Tell our side of the story. That seems wise, Margaret agreed. Better to face it head on than hide. After hanging up, Sarah rejoined Ethan and Jake, who had finalized arrangements for the interview to take place that afternoon. Elizabeth Chen had agreed to come to the Thompson estate rather than having Ethan travel to her studio, a consideration for his still recovering health. She'll want to interview you separately and then together, Jake explained. Be honest but careful. Anything you say can be quoted. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of preparation. The PR team sent over likely questions and suggested responses. Mrs. Winters helped Sarah select an appropriate outfit, professional but not overly formal. Security was increased around the property to prevent paparazzi intrusions. By the time Elizabeth Chen arrived, Sarah's nerves were at a breaking point. The journalist was a polished, serious woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Ms. Miller, she greeted Sarah with a firm handshake. Thank you for agreeing to this interview. I'd like to start with you, if that's acceptable. They settled in a small sitting room that had been prepared for the interview. After setting up her recording device, Elizabeth got straight to the point. For the record, what is your current relationship with Ethan Thompson? Sarah took a deep breath. Ethan and I met when I was working as a cleaning staff member at St. Luke's Hospital, where he was in a coma following his accident. I would read to him during my breaks, something recommended for coma patients. After he awoke, he offered me a position as his personal assistant during his recovery. And how did that professional relationship evolve into a personal one? Gradually, Sarah said honestly, we developed a friendship based on trust and shared experiences. The personal aspect of our relationship is very recent. Some would say the power dynamics between a billionaire CEO and his employee make a truly consensual relationship impossible. How would you respond to that? Sarah hadn't expected such a direct challenge. I would say those people don't know, either of us. Yes, Ethan has financial resources I don't, but our relationship isn't about money. It's about two people who connected during an extraordinary circumstance. Elizabeth's expression remained neutral. Alexander Thompson has suggested that his brother's brain injury has affected his judgment, particularly regarding personal relationships. Have you observed any cognitive impairment in Ethan? None, Sarah said firmly. Ethan's recovery has been remarkable. He runs board meetings, makes complex business decisions, and has completely returned to his pre-accident cognitive abilities. Dr. Morgan, his neurologist, has documented this thoroughly. The questions continued about her background, her mother, her career aspirations. Elizabeth was thorough but not hostile, allowing Sarah to tell her story without interruption. When it was Ethan's turn, Sarah waited anxiously in another room. Through the window, she noticed a van parking outside the security gate, a news van. Word was spreading about the exclusive interview. Jake joined her, looking concerned. More media is arriving. Security is keeping them at the gate, but they're persistent. How is this happening so fast? Sarah asked. Alexander is orchestrating it, Jake said grimly. He wants to create a circus atmosphere, make it look like Ethan's personal life is a tabloid spectacle. Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang with an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. Sarah Miller, a man's voice asked. Yes? This is David Webb from the Daily Chronicle. I'm working on a story about your father, Richard Miller. We have information that he's recently been in contact with Alexander Thompson. Would you care to comment? Sarah froze. My father. That's impossible. I haven't seen him in over 20 years. So you can't confirm that your father has provided information about your family to Alexander Thompson? No, I have no knowledge of that. Sarah ended the call, her hands shaking. Jake looked at her with concern. What was that about? Reporter saying my father has been in contact with Alexander. Sarah's mind raced. But that doesn't make sense. My father disappeared when I was a child. My mother told me he had gambling problems, got in trouble. Alexander would have the resources to find him, Jake pointed out. If he thought your father could provide damaging information about you. Sarah felt sick. Was this the secret Alexander had threatened to expose? But what could her long-absent father possibly know that would hurt her now? Before she could process this new worry, Mrs. Winters appeared to inform them that Ethan's interview was complete, and Elizabeth Chen was ready for their joint session. Sarah composed herself as best she could as she joined Ethan on a small sofa. He immediately sensed her distress and gave her a questioning look, but there was no time to explain before the cameras were rolling again. Elizabeth began with straightforward questions about their daily routine, Ethan's recovery progress, and Sarah's duties as his assistant. Then she shifted to more personal territory. Mr. Thompson, there are those who suggest that your brain injury has made you vulnerable to manipulation. How do you respond to that? Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. My brain injury was serious but temporary. My cognitive function has fully recovered, as my medical records clearly show. I find it interesting that the only person suggesting I'm being manipulated is my brother, who was caught attempting to sell my company while I was unconscious. Ms. Miller, how would you describe your relationship with Alexander Thompson? Sarah chose her words carefully. We've had limited interaction. After I overheard him discussing plans to sell Ethan's company with Olivia Rothschild, Ethan's former fiancée, our relationship became adversarial. Mr. Thompson, do you believe your brother's legal challenge is motivated by genuine concern for your welfare or something else? It's motivated by greed, Ethan said bluntly. Alexander has always resented my success. He saw my accident as an opportunity to take what he couldn't build himself. When that failed, he moved to Plan B, trying to have me declared incompetent. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, covering Alexander's allegations, Ethan's plans for the company, and their vision for the future. Elizabeth was thorough but fair, allowing them to present their side without the sensationalism of the tabloids. As the crew packed up their equipment, Elizabeth approached them privately. You should know that Alexander Thompson contacted me yesterday, offering evidence about Ms. Miller's past. I declined as it wasn't relevant to the story I'm telling, but be prepared, he's shopping it to other outlets with fewer scruples. What kind of evidence? Sarah asked, her anxiety spiking. Something about your father and a prior connection to the Thompson family, Elizabeth said. I didn't pursue the details since it seemed like a distraction from the real story, Alexander's attempt to seize control of Thompson Technologies. After Elizabeth left, Sarah turned to Ethan, her face pale. A reporter called me during your interview asking about my father. He said my father has been in contact with Alexander. And now this. a prior connection to your family? Ethan, I don't understand what's happening. Ethan looked equally confused. I've never heard of a Richard Miller having any connection to my family or business. Could Alexander be bluffing? Jake suggested, creating a fake scandal to distract from the real issues? Maybe, Ethan said, but he looked troubled. Let's get ahead of this. Jake, have our investigators look into any possible connection between Sarah's father and my family. And Sarah, it might help if we knew more about your father. Sarah nodded, though the prospect of digging into that painful part of her past was uncomfortable. I'll talk to my mother. She might know more than she's told me. That evening, Sarah sat with her mother in their suite, sharing the disturbing developments. Margaret listened silently, her expression growing increasingly troubled. Mom, is there something you haven't told me? Sarah asked finally. Some connection between Dad and the Thompson family? Margaret sighed deeply. I had hoped this would never come up. That part of our lives was over long ago. What part? Mom, please, I need to know. Margaret took her daughter's hands. Your father didn't just have gambling debts, Sarah. He worked for a time as a driver and personal assistant for William Thompson, Ethan's father. Sarah stared at her mother in shock. What? How is that possible? It was before you were born, Margaret explained. Richard was between jobs, and a friend connected him with the Thompson household. William was just starting to build his hardware business into something bigger. He needed help with deliveries, scheduling, that sort of thing. So Dad worked for Ethan's father, Sarah said slowly. That's the big secret? Margaret looked away. There's more. Richard. He stole from them. Not a lot at first. Petty cash, small inventory items. But eventually he took something significant. A prototype design for a specialized tool that William had developed. He sold it to a competitor. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. He stole intellectual property? Margaret nodded sadly. William Thompson found out and fired him, of course. He could have pressed charges, had Richard arrested, but he didn't. Instead, he made Richard sign an agreement never to work in the industry again and to stay away from the Thompson family. That's why we moved across the city right before you were born. Did Ethan know about this? I don't think so. He would have been very young then. William kept it quiet. I think he was embarrassed that he'd trusted Richard. Sarah tried to process this revelation. Her father had not only abandoned them, but had previously betrayed Ethan's family. If this became public, it would look like she had deliberately inserted herself into Ethan's life, perhaps seeking some kind of revenge or compensation. Alexander will use this, she said numbly. He'll twist it to make it seem like I targeted Ethan deliberately. That's ridiculous, Margaret insisted. You didn't even know about this connection. How could you have planned anything? It doesn't matter. The appearance will be enough. Sarah stood, pacing the room anxiously. I need to tell Ethan before he hears it from someone else. She found Ethan in his study, reviewing documents from the ongoing forensic audit of the company's finances. He looked up with a smile that quickly faded when he saw her expression. What's wrong? He asked, setting aside his work. Sarah sat across from him, her heart heavy. My mother just told me something that Alexander will likely use against us. It's about my father. She explained what her mother had revealed. Richard Miller's employment with William Thompson, the theft, the agreement to stay away from the family. I swear to you, Ethan, I had no idea about any of this until today, she finished, searching his face for his reaction. I never knew my father worked for your family, let alone that he stole from them. Ethan was silent for a long moment, processing the information. I was very young then, he said finally. I have vague memories of a man who drove my father around sometimes, but that's all. My father never spoke of any theft. If Alexander makes this public, people will think I deliberately sought you out, Sarah said, her voice breaking. That? I had some agenda beyond just doing my job. But that's not what happened, Ethan pointed out. You were assigned to clean my hospital room by chance. You had no way of knowing who I was when you started reading to me. Facts won't matter once. Alexander spins. This story, Sarah said miserably. The coincidence is too perfect. The daughter of a man who wronged your father, now involved with you after you suffered a brain injury. It looks calculated, like some kind of long-con revenge plot. Ethan moved around the desk to kneel in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. Sarah, look at me. I know you. I know your heart. Nothing Alexander says can change that. It's not just about us, Sarah argued. It's about your company, your reputation. If people believe I manipulated you, it strengthens Alexander's case that you're not competent to run Thompson Technologies. Then, we'll fight it, Ethan said firmly. We'll get ahead of the story, just like we did today. We'll explain exactly how we met, make it clear you had no prior knowledge of the connection. Sarah wasn't convinced. Maybe it would be better if I left, just until the legal issues are resolved. I could stay at that safe house you mentioned. No, Ethan said immediately. That's exactly what Alexander wants. If you leave now, it looks like an admission of guilt, like you were caught in some scheme. Before Sarah could respond, Jake burst into the room, his expression urgent. Turn on the TV, now. Ethan grabbed the remote and switched on the large screen on the wall. A breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. Exclusive. Thompson CEO's girlfriend linked to corporate espionage. The news anchor's voice filled the room. In a shocking development, sources close to the Thompson family have revealed that Sarah Miller, the woman currently living with Thompson Technologies CEO Ethan Thompson, is the daughter of Richard Miller, who was fired from Thompson Hardware 27 years ago for stealing proprietary designs. Miller's daughter has allegedly infiltrated the CEO's life following his traumatic brain injury. Ethan muted the television, his face dark with anger. He didn't waste any time. Jake nodded grimly. It's on all the major channels. Alexander gave a statement expressing deep concern that his brother has unknowingly invited the daughter of a man who once betrayed their father into his home and confidence. Sarah felt physically ill. Her worst fears were being realized in real time, broadcast to millions of viewers. This is a nightmare. It gets worse, Jake continued reluctantly. They're claiming to have located your father, Sarah. He's supposedly giving an exclusive interview tomorrow morning. My father, Sarah exclaimed, but I haven't seen or heard from him in over 20 years. Alexander would have paid him well, Ethan said bitterly. A man with gambling problems wouldn't turn down that kind of money. Sarah stood abruptly. I need to talk to my mother again. She might know something more, something that could help us counter whatever my father might say. Margaret was already watching the news when Sarah returned to their suite. Her face was ashen, her hands trembling slightly. I never thought Richard would go this far, she said as Sarah entered. To publicly humiliate his own daughter for money. Do you know where he is, Mum? Have you had any contact with him over the years? Margaret shook her head. No, but I heard from an old friend about 5 years ago that he was living in Atlantic City, still gambling, still running from debts. Sarah sat beside her mother, taking her hand. Mom, I need to know everything about what happened back then, every detail that might be relevant. If Dad is going to tell his story on national television, we need to be prepared. While Sarah was with her mother, Ethan called an emergency, meeting with his legal and PR teams. The situation was escalating rapidly, and they needed a comprehensive strategy. We need to counter this narrative immediately, Brian Coleman, the attorney, advised. The connection between Sarah's father and your family from nearly 3 decades, Fargo, is tenuous at best. The idea that she somehow orchestrated meeting you in the hospital is absurd. Absurd, but damaging, the PR consultant pointed out. The timing couldn't be worse, with the competency hearing scheduled for next week. This plays right into Alexander's claims about Ethan's impaired judgment. Ethan rubbed his temples, fighting a growing headache. What's our best move? We need Sarah's mother on record, Brian suggested. If she can confirm that Sarah had no knowledge of the connection, that helps. We should also highlight the randomness of your initial meeting. Hospital staff assignments are documented. Sarah didn't choose to clean your room, she was assigned to it. And we need to get ahead of Richard Miller's interview, the PR consultant added. Whatever. He says tomorrow we need to be ready with an immediate response. As they strategized, Jake received a call that made him step out of the room. When he returned, his expression was unreadable. What is it? Ethan asked, instantly alert. That was Davis, Jake said, referring to the head of security. His team has been monitoring unusual activity around the estate. They just intercepted someone trying to breach the perimeter on the east side, near the old service entrance. A reporter, Ethan guessed. No, Jake said gravely. It was Alexander. The room fell silent. Ethan stood slowly, anger building. My brother tried to break into my home. Why? Davis is questioning him now. He claims he just wanted to talk to you privately, without lawyers or staff around. But he had bolt cutters and was attempting to disable part of the security system. That doesn't sound like someone coming for a friendly chat, Brian observed dryly. Ethan's phone rang. It was Davis. After a brief conversation, Ethan's face hardened. Alexander was carrying a recording device and a folder of documents. He's refusing to say what they were for, but given the circumstances, he was coming for Sarah, Jake concluded. To confront her, record her reactions, maybe try to get her to admit to something he could use against her. I've had enough, Ethan declared, his voice cold with fury. Davis is holding him until the police arrive. I want him charged with trespassing and attempted breaking and entering. Ethan, think carefully, Brian cautioned. Pressing charges against your brother will escalate this further. It might be better to... To what? Ethan interrupted. Let him continue attacking Sarah, spreading lies about her, breaking into my home to harass her? No, this ends now. The situation continued to develop rapidly over the next few hours. Police arrived to take Alexander into custody, resulting in more news crews gathering at the gates. Sarah's father, apparently tipped off about Alexander's arrest, called the same reporter who had contacted Sarah earlier, claiming he had explosive revelations about his daughter's past. By midnight, the Thompson estate was effectively under siege. News vans lined the street outside, reporters shouted questions through the gates, and online speculation about Sarah's true motives reached fever pitch. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah and Ethan found a quiet moment together in the garden room, away from the lights and noise. I'm so sorry about all of this, Sarah said, her voice heavy with exhaustion and guilt. I never imagined my father's actions from before I was even born could cause so much trouble. Ethan took her hand, his touch gentle despite the tension radiating from him. None of this is your fault, Sarah. Alexander orchestrated every bit of it. But if I hadn't come into your life, then I might still be in that coma, Ethan interrupted firmly. Or awake, but without the truth about my brother and Olivia. You saved me, Sarah, never doubt that. She leaned against him, drawing comfort from his steady presence. What happens now? With Alexander arrested, your competency hearing next week, my father's interview tomorrow. Now we face it all head on, Ethan said with quiet determination. No more reacting to Alexander's moves. It's time we take control of this narrative completely. How? Ethan's eyes held a look of resolve she hadn't seen before, not anger or fear, but absolute certainty. By removing any doubt about my mental competency or my feelings for you. He took both her hands in his. Sarah Miller, will you marry me? Sarah stared at him in shock. What? Marry me, Ethan repeated. Not next week or next month, but tomorrow. Before your father's interview, before the competency hearing, before Alexander can create any more chaos. Ethan, we can't, it's too soon, and under these circumstances, people would think, I don't care what people think, he said passionately. I care about you, about us. I know this is sudden, but I also know what I feel. I love you, Sarah. I think I've loved you since I first heard your voice reading to me in the darkness. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of overwhelming emotion. I love you too, she whispered. But marriage? Now? It would only give Alexander more ammunition. No, Ethan argued gently. It would take his most powerful weapon away. He's trying to paint you as an opportunist, me as a victim of manipulation. But if we choose this path together, openly and deliberately, it changes the entire narrative. People will say I'm after your money, Sarah pointed out. Let them. We'll have an ironclad prenuptial agreement drawn up that protects the company and my assets. It will make it clear that this isn't about financial gain for you. Sarah's mind raced, considering all angles. It was crazy, impulsive, entirely unlike her usual careful approach to life. And yet, there was logic to it. More importantly, there was love. Real, unexpected, powerful love that had grown between them, despite the most improbable circumstances. What about my mother? She asked, practical even in this surreal moment. She's included in whatever decision you make. Ethan assured her. Her home here is secure regardless. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a cliff. If, and it's still if, we did this, it would have to be small, private. Just us, my mother, Jake, maybe Dr. Morgan. Ethan's face lit up with hope. Is that a yes? It's a, I think you might be right, but I'm terrified, Sarah admitted with a small laugh. I need to talk to my mother first. Margaret, to Sarah's surprise, was completely supportive of the idea. Life is short, darling, she said simply. I've watched you two together. What you have is real. If this also helps defeat Alexander's schemes, all the better. And so in the pre-dawn hours of the next morning, while news crews still camped outside the gates unaware, a judge who was an old friend of Dr. Morgan's arrived at the Thompson estate. Jake had arranged for flowers, a simple cake and champagne. Dr. Morgan came with his wife, bringing medical records documenting Ethan's complete cognitive recovery as a wedding gift, evidence that would be crucial in the upcoming hearing. Sarah wore a simple cream-colored dress that Mrs. Winters helped her select from her limited wardrobe. Margaret sat in her wheelchair by the garden room windows, beaming with pride, and Ethan, standing tall without his cane for the first time since his accident, looked at Sarah with such love and certainty that her last doubts melted away. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, their vows simple and sincere. As they exchanged rings, a plain gold band for Ethan and for Sarah, a modest diamond that had been Ethan's mother's, Sarah felt a sense of rightness that transcended all the chaos surrounding them. Just before they were pronounced husband and wife, the judge asked if anyone present knew of any reason they should not be joined in matrimony. In the silence that followed, the doors to the garden room burst open. Davis stood there, his expression urgent. Sorry to interrupt, but you all need to see this right away. He turned on the television mounted on the wall. Richard Miller's much-anticipated interview was beginning, but it wasn't what anyone expected. Yes, I worked for William Thompson years ago, Richard was saying to the interviewer. And yes, I was fired for stealing, I'm not proud of it. But what Alexander Thompson asked me to do, to lie about my daughter, to claim she knew about my past and deliberately targeted his brother, that's a line I won't cross, not even for the money he offered. The interviewer looked shocked. Are you saying Alexander Thompson attempted to bribe you to lie about your daughter? Richard nodded grimly. He offered me $200,000 to say Sarah had always known about my connection to the Thompsons, that she had harbored resentment about how they treated me, and that she had talked for years about finding a way to infiltrate their lives. But none of that is true. None of it. I haven't seen Sarah since she was a child. Her mother raised her to be honest, hard-working, everything I wasn't. Whatever relationship she has with Ethan Thompson happened by chance, not design. The room was silent as they absorbed this unexpected turn of events. Then Jake started laughing. Well, I guess Alexander didn't pay him enough. Ethan squeezed Sarah's hand, his eyes shining with emotion. Shall we continue? The judge cleared his throat. By the power vested in me by the state of New York, I now pronounce you husband and wife. As Ethan leaned in to kiss his bride, Sarah felt a wave of peace wash over her. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, the competency hearing, running the company, building a life together, they would face them, united, their bond forged in adversity and sealed with love. Outside the Thompson estate, the sun rose on a new day, bringing light to shadows and truth to darkness. And inside, surrounded by the few people who truly mattered, Ethan and Sarah Thompson began the next chapter of their improbable, beautiful story. News of Ethan and Sarah's surprise wedding spread quickly, despite their efforts to keep it private. By mid-morning, reporters were shouting questions through the gates. Sarah, did you marry Ethan for his money? Mr. Thompson, was this a reaction to your brother's arrest? Is there a prenuptial agreement? Inside the Thompson estate, the newlyweds held an emergency meeting with their legal team. Brian Coleman, looking more harried than usual, spread several documents across the conference table. The good news is that Richard Miller's interview has caused a significant shift in public perception, he reported. His refusal to lie about Sarah, even when offered money, has cast Alexander in a very negative light. Several news outlets are now investigating Alexander's actions rather than focusing on Sarah's past. And the bad news, Ethan asked, his hand firmly holding Sarah's beneath the table. The judge for your competency hearing has expressed concern about the timing of your marriage, Brian admitted. She's questioning whether it represents another impulsive decision that could indicate compromised judgment. Sarah felt a pang of guilt. Perhaps they should have waited until after the hearing. That's absurd, Ethan said firmly. Getting married to someone I love is hardly evidence of mental incompetence. I agree, Brian assured him, and we have Dr. Morgan's comprehensive evaluation supporting your full cognitive recovery. But we need to be prepared for Alexander's team to portray the wedding as a rash decision influenced by Sarah. What about Alexander's arrest? Jake asked. Surely breaking into Ethan's property with recording equipment shows he's the one acting irrationally. Alexander was released on bail this morning, Brian informed them. His legal team is claiming he was simply trying to have a private conversation with his brother and didn't realize he was triggering security systems. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. Even with all his lies exposed, he's still finding ways to twist the truth. That's what skilled lawyers do, Brian said with a hint of professional admiration. But his credibility has been severely damaged. The attempted bribery of your father is particularly damning. Has anyone actually spoken to my father? Sarah asked. After seeing his interview, she found herself curious about the man who had been absent for most of her life. He's staying at the Westside Hotel, Jake said. He asked if you might be willing to meet with him. Sarah glanced at her mother, who had insisted on attending the meeting despite her fatigue. Margaret's expression was carefully neutral. I'll think about it, Sarah said non-committally. The meeting continued with discussions of strategy for the upcoming hearing. When it concluded, Sarah found herself alone with her mother in the garden room that had been the site of her wedding just hours earlier. You want to see him, don't you? Margaret asked perceptively. Sarah sighed. I don't know, part of me is curious. He stood up for me when he could have taken Alexander's money. That counts for something. It does, Margaret agreed. But remember, Richard has always been charming and convincing. Don't expect too much from him, Sarah. I won't, Sarah promised. But after everything that's happened, I think I need to at least hear what he has to say. Later that afternoon, arrangements were made for Richard Miller to come to the Thompson estate. Security would be tight, and both Ethan and Jake insisted on being nearby during the meeting, though they agreed to give Sarah privacy for the actual conversation. Sarah waited in the small library, her stomach in knots. The last time she had seen her father, she had been 7 years old. She had vague memories of a tall man with a ready smile who had once taught her to ride a bicycle, but who had been increasingly absent as her childhood progressed. The pain of his final abandonment had faded over the years, replaced by a dull acceptance that some parents simply weren't capable of staying. When the door opened, Sarah stood, her heart racing. The man who entered was older than she expected. His hair mostly grey, his face lined, his posture slightly stooped, but the smile was familiar, triggering a cascade of childhood memories. Sarah, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Look at you, all grown up. She didn't move toward him, maintaining her position across the room. Hello, Dad. An awkward silence fell between them. Richard shifted uncomfortably, then gestured to a chair. May I sit? Sarah nodded stiffly, returning to her own seat. Thank you for what you said in your interview about not lying about me. Richard's expression darkened. That snake Alexander offered me a fortune to throw my own daughter under the bus. I may not have been much of a father, but even I have limits. Why did you agree to the interview at all? Sarah asked. Richard looked down, shame evident in his posture. Money, initially. I've been struggling. When Alexander's people found me, the offer was tempting, he sighed. But when they told me what they wanted me to say about you, I couldn't do it. Instead, I decided to use the platform to tell the truth. About your theft from William Thompson? Yes, Richard admitted. Not my finest moment. I was desperate then too, in debt to some dangerous people. I told myself it was just a design, just paper. I didn't realize how important it was to William until it was too late. Sarah studied the man before her, trying to reconcile this apologetic figure with both the father of her childhood memories and the villain of her mother's stories. Mom said William Thompson could have had you arrested but didn't. Richard nodded. He showed me mercy I didn't deserve. Made me sign that agreement to stay away from his family and business instead. I've kept that promise until now. He smiled wryly. Though I never imagined my daughter would end up married to his son. Life is strange that way. You really had. No contact with the Thompsons all these years? None, Richard confirmed. After I left your mother, I drifted. Atlantic City, Vegas, anywhere I could find games. I've tried to get straight a few times, but he shrugged helplessly. Addiction is a powerful thing. Why didn't you ever contact us? Sarah asked, the question that had burned inside her for decades, finally finding voice. Even just a phone call, a letter. Richard's eyes filled with remorse. I told myself it was better this way, that you and your mother were better off without me bringing my chaos into your lives. But the truth is I was a coward, too ashamed to face the family I'd failed. Mom got sick, Sarah said, a hint of accusation in her tone. I had to drop out of nursing school to care for her. A little support from you would have made a difference. No, Richard said quietly. I have no excuses, Sarah, only regrets. They talked for nearly an hour, piecing together the broken history between them. Sarah learned about her father's multiple attempts at recovery, his brief second marriage. That had ended in divorce, his current life as a part-time poker dealer in Atlantic City. It wasn't a happy story, but at least it was honest. What will you do now, she asked as their time drew to a close. Alexander must be furious that you exposed him. I'm leaving town tonight, Richard said. It's probably safer that way, but I wanted to see you first, to apologize in person for everything, for leaving, for not being there when you needed me, for this mess with Alexander. Sarah felt a complicated mix of emotions, lingering hurt, a touch of pity, and a surprising sense of resolution. I appreciate that, and I'm glad we had this conversation. Richard stood to leave, then hesitated. Your husband seems like a good man. Not at all like his father, who was always a bit cold and calculating. I'm happy for you, Sarah. You deserved better than what I gave you, and it looks like you found it. I did, Sarah agreed, thinking of Ethan waiting nearby. Despite everything Alexander has done to try to tear us apart. Speaking of Alexander, Richard said, his expression turning serious, be careful. Men like him don't give up easily, especially when their pride is wounded. And right now his pride is in tatters. After Richard left, Ethan found Sarah still sitting in the library, lost in thought. He sat beside her, taking her hand. How did it go? Better than I expected, Sarah admitted. It doesn't erase the past, but at least now I understand some things better. Will you see him? Again? I don't know, maybe someday. She leaned against Ethan's shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. He warned me about Alexander, said he won't give up easily. We know that, Ethan agreed. But with everything that's happened, the failed bribery attempt, his arrest, his credibility is severely damaged. Even his lawyers are starting to distance themselves. I hope you're right, Sarah said, but a shadow of worry remained. The next morning brought news that seemed to confirm Ethan's optimistic assessment. Alexander's lawyers had approached Brian about a potential settlement. In exchange for dropping all allegations of incompetence and legal challenges to Ethan's control of the company, Alexander wanted immunity from prosecution for the break-in and a substantial financial settlement. He's desperate, Jake observed as they discussed the offer over breakfast. The competency hearing is in 2 days, and he knows he's going to lose. What do you think, Brian? Ethan asked the lawyer, who had joined them via video conference. It's a reasonable offer from a legal standpoint, Brian admitted. Settling would avoid the stress and public spectacle of the hearing. But it's your decision, Ethan. If you want your day in court to clear your name completely, that's your right. Sarah watched Ethan carefully, knowing how much Alexander's betrayal had hurt him. What do you want to do? She asked softly. Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering. I want this over, he said finally. Not for Alexander's sake, but for ours. For the company's employees who deserve stability. For my own peace of mind. Then we'll settle, Brian confirmed. I'll draw up the paperwork today, with the prospect of resolution on the horizon, A sense of cautious optimism filled the Thompson household. For the first time since Ethan's discharge from the hospital, they could envision a future not dominated by legal battles and public scrutiny. Sarah and Margaret spent the morning planning improvements to the East Garden, which Mr. Chen had suggested could be transformed into a therapeutic space for Ethan's final stages of recovery. Ethan and Jake reviewed business matters, making plans for the company's direction once the legal issues were resolved. The calm was shattered just after noon when Davis burst into Ethan's office, his normally composed demeanor visibly shaken. "Sir, there's a situation at the front gate. Alexander is there with a large group of reporters and what appears to be a court official." Ethan and Sarah hurried to the security monitors, where they could see Alexander standing before a crowd of cameras, gesturing dramatically toward the house. "What is he doing?" Sarah asked, bewildered. "I thought his lawyers were drafting a settlement." Jake was already on the phone with Brian, his expression growing increasingly grim as he listened. "Brian says Alexander fired his legal team this morning," he reported after hanging up. "He's representing himself now and has withdrawn the settlement offer." On the monitor, they could see Alexander holding up documents for the cameras. "Turn on the news," Ethan instructed Davis. "Let's see what he's saying." The television in the security office flickered to life, showing a live broadcast from their front gate. Alexander's voice filled the room. "Evidence that my brother is being controlled by this woman and her mother, who have strategically positioned themselves in his life to take advantage of his compromised mental state. I have here a temporary emergency order requiring an immediate psychiatric evaluation of Ethan Thompson and removal of Sarah Miller Thompson from the property during the assessment." "Is that even possible?" Sarah gasped. "Can he do that?" Brian's voice came through the speakerphone Jake had activated. "It's a desperate ploy. He's found a sympathetic judge and presented one-sided evidence, but it won't stand up to challenge once we get involved." "In the meantime, do we have to comply?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with anger. "Technically, yes," Brian admitted, "but we can file for an immediate stay. The problem is, if you resist now, it could be used against you in court as evidence of irrationality or paranoia." Alexander's voice continued from the television. "I'm simply trying to protect my brother from those who would take advantage of his vulnerability. This emergency evaluation is in his best interest, and I'm confident it will confirm my concerns about his decision-making capacity." Sarah felt sick. Just when they thought the situation was resolving, Alexander had found yet another way to attack them. "What happens in an emergency psychiatric evaluation?" she asked, dreading the answer. "It's usually conducted at a hospital," Brian explained. "The subject is interviewed by multiple psychiatric professionals who assess their mental state, decision-making capacity, and potential vulnerability to undue influence." "Hospital?" Ethan repeated, alarm evident in his voice. "I'm not going back to a hospital." Sarah understood his reaction immediately. After 2 months in a coma, the prospect of returning to a medical facility, even briefly, was traumatic. "There must be another option," she insisted. "There is," Brian said. "We can petition for the evaluation to be conducted here at the estate by independent experts, but we need to act quickly before they try to enforce this order as written." While Brian began the legal countermeasures, Davis informed them that the court official at the gate, a psychiatric professional accompanied by a sheriff's deputy, was requesting entry to serve the order and begin the evaluation process. "Them in," Ethan decided after consulting with Brian. "But only those two, not Alexander or the press." As they prepared to receive the visitors, Sarah pulled Ethan aside. "Should I leave? The order apparently requires my removal during the assessment." "Absolutely not," Ethan said firmly. "That part of the order is based on Alexander's false claims that you're somehow controlling me. If I allow you to be removed, it gives credence to his allegations." The psychiatric evaluator, Dr. Elaine Foster, proved to be a serious professional woman in her 60s. She explained the situation with straightforward clarity. "Mr. Thompson, I want to be clear that I'm approaching this evaluation with no preconceptions. Judge Wilson has ordered an assessment based on petitions filed by your brother, but I'm here to make an independent determination." "I understand," Ethan said, "and I'm willing to cooperate fully. but I would like my wife to remain present, contrary to what my brother has requested. Dr. Foster considered this. Given that one of the concerns raised is about undue influence from your wife, having her present during the evaluation could be problematic. What if I promise not to speak during the assessment? Sarah suggested. I just want to be here for moral support. That would be acceptable, Dr. Foster agreed after a moment, as long as you understand that any attempt to influence Mr. Thompson's responses would invalidate the process. The evaluation proceeded in Ethan's study. Dr. Foster asked detailed questions about his accident, recovery, decision-making processes, and his relationship with Sarah. She administered standard cognitive tests and inquired about his business decisions since awakening from the coma. Throughout it all, Sarah remained silent as promised, seated in a corner of the room. She watched with pride as Ethan answered each question thoughtfully and clearly, demonstrating his complete cognitive recovery and sound judgment. After nearly 2 hours, Dr. Foster concluded the formal assessment. Mr. Thompson, based on my evaluation, I see no evidence of cognitive impairment or vulnerability to undue influence. Your decision-making appears sound, and your relationship with your wife seems to be based on genuine affection and mutual respect. Relief washed over Sarah. So this emergency order was unnecessary? In my professional opinion, yes, Dr. Foster confirmed. I'll be reporting to Judge Wilson that I found no basis for concerns about Mr. Thompson's competency or the need for any protective measures. What about Alexander's claims? Ethan asked. About Sarah manipulating me. Dr. Foster's expression turned sympathetic. Mr. Thompson, family conflicts can be complicated and painful. Your brother appears to have genuine concerns, though his methods of addressing them are questionable. However, I see no evidence that your wife has manipulated or controlled you in any way. After Dr. Foster and the deputy left, promising to file their report immediately, Ethan pulled Sarah into a tight embrace. It's almost over, he murmured into her hair. Once the judge receives that report, Alexander will have no legal grounds left to stand on. I hope you're right, Sarah said, allowing herself to believe for the first time that they might actually emerge from this nightmare intact. Outside the Thompson estate, Alexander watched the psychiatric evaluator's car drive away. His face, once handsome but now haggard with stress and bitterness, twisted with frustration. This latest gambit had failed, just like his previous attempts. His brother was slipping through his fingers, taking with him the power and wealth Alexander had coveted for so long, but he wasn't finished yet. There was one card left to play, a dangerous one that would burn bridges permanently, but Alexander was past caring about consequences. All that mattered now was winning, no matter the cost. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he had sworn never to use. It's time, he said when the call connected. I need you to do exactly what we discussed. And remember, if this works, you'll never have to worry about money again. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a beautiful day that seemed to reflect the cautious optimism within the Thompson household. Dr. Foster's report had been filed, strongly affirming Ethan's competency and recommending that the emergency order be rescinded immediately. Brian was confident that by afternoon the judge would formally withdraw the order and likely dismiss Alexander's broader petition for conservatorship. Sarah woke early, slipping out of bed without disturbing Ethan. After the stress of the previous day, he needed rest. She made her way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Winters was already preparing breakfast. Good morning, Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper greeted her with a warm smile. Sarah was still getting used to her new name, but she had to admit it gave her a small thrill each time she heard it. Good morning, Mrs. Winters. Is my mother up yet? Ms. Miller is having tea in the garden room. She said the morning light is particularly good for the orchids. Sarah smiled, pleased that her mother was finding joy in her new surroundings. Despite everything Alexander had done to disrupt their lives, Margaret had maintained a serene acceptance of the situation, focusing on the gardens that gave her purpose and satisfaction. As Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee, Davis entered the kitchen, his expression concerned. Mrs. Thompson, there's someone at the gate asking to speak with you. A woman who says she's an old friend from nursing school. Sarah frowned, trying to think who it might be. She had lost touch with most of her classmates after dropping out, Did she give a name? Lisa Brennan, Davis replied. She says it's urgent and personal. The name was familiar. A woman who had been in several of Sarah's classes, though they hadn't been particularly close. I suppose I could see her briefly. Can you bring her to the small sitting room? Davis nodded. I'll have security check her ID and escort her in. 10 minutes later, Sarah was greeting Lisa Brennan, a petite woman with auburn hair who seemed nervous and uncomfortable. Sarah, thank you for seeing me, Lisa said, declining to sit when offered. I'm sorry to come unannounced like this, but I needed to warn you. Warn me? Sarah repeated, instantly alert. About what? Lisa glanced around as if checking they were alone. Alexander Thompson contacted me yesterday. He offered me $10,000 to make a statement, saying that you had always talked about finding a rich husband to solve your financial problems during nursing school, that you specifically mentioned the Thompson family as targets. Sarah felt her stomach drop. That's ridiculous. We barely knew each other in school, and I never said anything like that. I know, Lisa agreed quickly. And I told him no, of course. But Sarah, he was desperate, scary almost. He said if I wouldn't help him, he'd find someone who would. I'm afraid he might have approached other classmates with the same offer. Thank you for telling me, Sarah said sincerely. And for refusing to lie, Lisa shifted uncomfortably. There's more. He mentioned something about having evidence of financial fraud. Something about your student loans and your mother's medical bills? He was vague, but he implied he had documentation of something improper. Sarah's mind raced. There was nothing improper about her financial history, but she had been desperate at times, juggling student loans and her mother's mounting medical expenses. Had she made some technical error on an application, or form that Alexander could twist into something sinister? I should go, Lisa said, checking her watch. I just wanted you to know what he's planning. Be careful, Sarah. He seemed like someone with nothing left to lose. After Lisa left, Sarah immediately sought out Jake to share this latest development. They found him in the security office, already looking troubled. We've got a problem, he announced before Sarah could speak. Alexander held a press conference this morning, announcing he has definitive proof of financial improprieties involving both you and your mother. He's claiming you committed fraud on loan applications and insurance forms to secure funds for your mother's treatments. That's what Lisa just told me he was planning, Sarah said, explaining her former classmate's visit. But I never did anything fraudulent. We struggled financially, yes, but everything was above board. Alexander doesn't need actual proof, Jake pointed out grimly. He just needs to create enough doubt and suspicion to damage your credibility before the final hearing. Sarah felt a surge of protective anger. My mother has done nothing wrong. She's already been through so much. I won't let Alexander drag her name through the mud too. We need to get ahead of this, Jake agreed. I've already asked Brian to look into what specific allegations Alexander might be preparing to make. In the meantime, we should warn your mother and Ethan. Margaret took the news with her usual calm dignity. There's nothing to find, she said simply. We may have been poor, but we were honest. Ethan was less composed. This has gone beyond a legal battle or sibling rivalry, he said, pacing the study with barely contained fury. Alexander is attacking innocent people now. Your mother, your former classmates. It has to stop. The hearing is tomorrow, Sarah reminded him. Once the judge dismisses his petition, this will all be over, but Ethan shook his head. Even if he loses in court, he'll keep finding ways to hurt us, to hurt you. Alexander has always been relentless when he wants something. What are you suggesting? Sarah asked, concerned by the dangerous gleam in Ethan's eyes. I'm going to offer him a deal, one final settlement that will end this permanently. What kind of deal? Money, Ethan said simply. Enough that he can live comfortably far away from here, but structured so that he receives it only if he adheres to strict conditions, including never contacting any of us again. Do you think he'll accept? Sarah asked dubiously. After everything he's done, would he just walk away? Alexander has always cared about two things, money and status. He's already lost the status he had as my brother and a Thompson executive. If I offer enough money in the right way, I think he'll take it. Sarah wasn't convinced, but she understood Ethan's need to try one last diplomatic solution. Just be careful, she urged. Alexander is desperate now, and desperate people can be dangerous. Ethan arranged to meet Alexander that evening at a neutral location, a private room at an upscale restaurant downtown. Despite Sarah's concerns, he insisted on going alone. Alexander needs to feel he's being treated as an equal, not confronted by a group, he explained as he prepared to leave. Okay, so. And your presence would only inflame the situation. Sarah watched from the window as Ethan's car pulled away from the estate, a sense of foreboding settling over her. Something about this meeting felt wrong, dangerous even. But Ethan was determined to end the conflict his way, and she had to respect his decision. Hours passed with no word from Ethan. Sarah tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Just as she was about to ask Jake to check, on the meeting her own phone rang with an unknown number. "Sarah Miller," a woman's voice asked when she answered. "Yes, this is Sarah Thompson now. Who's calling?" "This is Nurse Rodriguez from Mercy Hospital Emergency Department. Your husband, Ethan Thompson, has been admitted following an incident at Rossini's restaurant. He's asking for you." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What happened? Is he all right?" "He's stable," the nurse assured her. "But I can't give more information over the phone. Can you come to the hospital?" "I'll be right there," Sarah promised, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. Jake insisted on driving her to the hospital, bringing along a security team in a separate vehicle. As they sped through the evening traffic, Sarah's thoughts turned dark. Had Alexander hurt Ethan? Was this some kind of trap? At the hospital, Sarah was immediately escorted to a treatment room where Ethan lay on a bed, his face pale, but alert. A bandage covered his right temple, and an IV ran into his arm. "Ethan!" she cried, rushing to his side. "What happened?" He grasped her hand weakly. "I'm okay. Just a mild concussion and some bruised ribs." "Alexander did this?" she asked, though. She already knew the answer. Ethan nodded grimly. "He wasn't interested in my settlement offer. He said it was too late for money, that this was about making me pay for taking everything from him." Ethan winced as he shifted position. "When I stood to leave, he threw a glass at my head. I fell and hit the table on my way down. Restaurant security detained him until police arrived." "He's been arrested?" "Yes, for assault. This time there's no ambiguity about his intentions." Ethan squeezed her hand. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I thought I could reason with him, find a peaceful solution." Sarah felt tears of relief and anger mingling as she kissed his hand. "Don't apologize. You tried to do the right thing. Alexander is the one who chose violence." The doctor insisted on keeping Ethan overnight for observation, given his history of brain injury. Though the concussion was mild, they wanted to take every precaution. Sarah refused to leave his side, settling into the uncomfortable hospital chair for the night. As Ethan slept, sedated by pain medication, Sarah reflected on the twisted path that had brought them to this point. From her first days reading to an unconscious stranger, through betrayals and threats and legal battles, to this moment, sitting beside her husband in yet another hospital room. It wasn't the fairy tale romance young girls dreamed of, but it was real and hard-won, forged in adversity, and strengthened by each challenge they overcame together. Morning brought news that the competency hearing had been formally cancelled. With Alexander under arrest for assault, and Dr. Foster's evaluation strongly affirming Ethan's mental capacity, the judge had dismissed all pending petitions. The legal battle, at least, was over. "What happens with Alexander now?" Sarah asked. Jake, who had arrived early with clean clothes for both of them. "He'll face assault charges, possibly additional charges for the previous break-in attempt," Jake explained. "Given his state of mind, his lawyers will likely pursue a psychiatric defense." "Ironic," Ethan commented dryly. "He spent months trying to prove I was mentally incompetent, and now he'll claim temporary insanity to avoid prison." "I just want him out of our lives," Sarah admitted. "However that happens." Ethan was discharged that afternoon with instructions to rest and avoid stress, a tall order given recent events. As they drove back to the Thompson estate, Sarah noticed her husband seemed unusually quiet, pensive even. "What are you thinking?" "About?" she asked softly. "How close I came to losing everything," Ethan replied, looking out at the passing scenery. "Not just the company or my health, but my sense of who I am. When I woke up from that coma and discovered my brother's betrayal, it shook my foundation. The person I trusted most had tried to steal everything from me. Sarah squeezed his hand, letting him continue. And then there was you, Ethan said, turning to face her. A stranger who had no reason to care, who risked everything to help me. You gave me back something I didn't even realize I'd lost. Faith in people, in genuine connection. You gave me something too, Sarah said softly. A chance to use my voice when I'd spent so long feeling invisible. Every night when I read to you, I felt like I mattered, like what I did made a difference. As they passed through the gates of the Thompson estate, returning to the home they now truly shared, both felt a sense of completion, of a chapter closing and a new one beginning. Alexander's dark shadow no longer loomed over them. The legal battles were resolved. They could finally begin to build the life they wanted, not just react to threats and challenges. That evening, as they sat in the garden room watching the sunset, surrounded by the flowers that Margaret had helped nurture back to health, Ethan reached for Sarah's hand. I've been thinking about the future, he said. Not just mine or yours, but ours. What? Do you want our life to look like, Sarah, now that we can choose freely? Sarah considered the question, appreciating that he had asked rather than assumed. I want to finish my nursing degree, she said thoughtfully. Not because we need the money, but because it matters to me. I want to help people, make a difference. I think that's perfect, Ethan said warmly. And I've been considering stepping back from day-to-day operations at the company. Jake has proven himself more than capable as interim CEO. Maybe it's time to make that permanent. Are you sure? The company has been your life for so long. Ethan nodded, his expression serene. The accident changed my perspective. Nearly dying has a way of clarifying what really matters. He smiled at her. And what matters most to me now is building a life with you, one with purpose, beyond just accumulating wealth or power. The foundation you mentioned before, Sarah recalled. For medical research and patient support. Yes, Ethan confirmed. I've already discussed it with the board. We'll fund it through Thompson Technologies, but it will operate independently. I'd like you to help shape it if you're interested. Sarah felt a surge of excitement at the prospect. I'd love that. I've seen firsthand how the healthcare system fails people who don't have resources or advocates. We could make a real difference. As twilight deepened around them, they continued planning their future. Dreams and possibilities that just weeks ago had seemed impossible. From the darkest circumstances had emerged a partnership neither could have imagined, a second chance at life itself. In the quiet garden room with the first stars appearing in the evening sky, Sarah and Ethan Thompson embraced their new beginning, grateful for the unlikely path that had brought them together and the strength they had found in each other to overcome every obstacle. Their story, which had begun in the sterile confines of Hospital Room 507, would continue to unfold in ways neither could predict. But whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced Alexander's threats and Ethan's recovery, together, with unwavering faith in each other and the love that had bloomed in the most unexpected of places. The grand ballroom of the Thompson Hotel sparkled with light from crystal chandeliers, illuminating hundreds of elegantly dressed guests. At the center of it all stood Ethan and Sarah Thompson, greeting supporters and donors at the inaugural gala for the Thompson's Second Chance Foundation. Sarah looked radiant in a simple but elegant blue gown, her hair swept up in a sophisticated style that would have been unimaginable to the hospital cleaner she had been just over a year ago. Beside her, Ethan stood tall and confident, no trace remaining of the physical weakness that had plagued him after awakening from his coma. Mrs. Miller, you've outdone yourself with the floral arrangements, Dr. Morgan commented, approaching, them with a glass of champagne in hand. The neurologist had become a close friend and valued advisor to the foundation. Margaret Miller, seated nearby in her wheelchair, but looking healthier than she had in years, beamed with pride. The greenhouse at the estate has been producing the most beautiful blooms. I couldn't resist using them for such a special occasion. They're perfect, Mom, Sarah said, squeezing her mother's shoulder affectionately. Just like everything else. Tonight. Ethan wrapped an arm around his wife's waist. I think we can officially call this launch a success. We've already exceeded our initial fundraising goal and the night is still young. Jake Reynolds approached, looking every bit the confident CEO he had become over the past year. The board members are impressed, he reported with a smile, especially with the research grants program Sarah designed. They're calling it innovative and forward-thinking. Sarah blushed slightly at the praise. She had thrown herself into the foundation's development while simultaneously completing her nursing degree. The program Jake referred to focused on funding, research for treatments and therapies for patients with traumatic brain injuries and long-term coma. Patients, particularly those without financial resources. None of this would exist without you, Ethan told her quietly, as Jake moved on to greet other guests. You inspired every part of it. We built it together, Sarah corrected him gently. Just like everything else this past year. Their first year of marriage had been busy but fulfilling. After Alexander's arrest and subsequent commitment to a psychiatric facility, the media frenzy had gradually died down. Ethan had officially stepped back from day-to-day operations at Thompson Technologies, naming Jake as permanent CEO while retaining his position as chairman of the board. Sarah had completed her nursing degree with honors and now divided her time between clinical work at St. Luke's Hospital, where she had once been a member of the cleaning staff, and directing the foundation's patient advocacy programs. Margaret had flourished in her role overseeing the estate's extensive gardens, even developing a horticultural therapy program that had become part of the foundation's rehabilitation services for recovering patients. There's Davis signaling us, Ethan noted, spotting their head of security at the ballroom entrance. It must be time for the presentation. They made their way to the small stage that had been set up at one end of the ballroom. As Sarah watched Ethan step up to the microphone, she felt a familiar surge of pride and love. He had come so far from the unconscious patient she had first met, surviving not only a devastating accident, but also his brother's betrayal and the subsequent legal battles. Good evening, friends and supporters, Ethan began, his voice strong and clear. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate the launch of the Thompson Second Chance Foundation. As many of you know, this organization was born from my own experience, waking up from a 2-month coma after a near-fatal accident, facing the long and challenging road to recovery. The room quieted, guests hanging on his every word. During that dark time, I discovered what truly matters in life. It's not wealth or status or power, it's connection to people who genuinely care, who see you as a person, not a position or a bank account. His eyes found Sarah's in the crowd, and his expression softened. I was fortunate. I had excellent medical care and the financial resources to support my recovery, but I also had something many patients don't. Someone who sat with me during those long silent nights, who read to me when I couldn't respond, who fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as Ethan continued. The Foundation's mission is simple, but vital, to ensure that every patient facing traumatic injury or extended hospitalization has both the medical support and the human connection they need to heal. To give everyone a second chance regardless of their circumstances. He gestured for Sarah to join him on stage. As she stepped up beside him, the audience broke into warm applause. I'd like to introduce my wife, Sarah Thompson, the heart and soul of this foundation. Without her compassion and courage, I wouldn't be standing here today. Sarah took the microphone, momentarily overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her to this moment. Thank you all for your support and generosity, she began, finding her voice. A little over a year ago, I was a hospital cleaner who made a simple choice: to treat an unconscious patient with dignity and kindness. I never imagined where that choice would lead. She glanced at Ethan, drawing strength from his presence. Many have called our story unusual or exceptional, but I believe the capacity for compassion exists in all of us. The Foundation's programs are designed to nurture that compassion in our healthcare systems and support those who need it most during their most vulnerable moments. After their speeches, a video presentation showcased the Foundation's first initiatives: a patient companionship program at 3 major hospitals, research grants for innovative coma therapies, and a rehabilitation center offering services regardless of patients' ability to pay. As the evening progressed, Sarah found a quiet moment with her mother in a corner of the ballroom. "I'm so proud of you," Margaret said, her eyes shining. Your father would be proud too, if he could see you now. Richard Miller had made sporadic contact over the past year, still struggling with his gambling addiction, but making efforts to maintain a cautious relationship with the daughter he had abandoned. He had declined the invitation to tonight's gala, feeling it wasn't his place, but had sent a simple card expressing his admiration for Sarah's accomplishments. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life," Sarah admitted. "From dropping out of nursing school to care for you to cleaning hospital rooms to this." She gestured at the glamorous surroundings. "It doesn't seem real." "It's real because you earned it," Margaret said firmly. "Not the money or the position. Those came with Ethan. But his love and respect, the foundation's success, the difference you're making, those you earned through your own strength and compassion." Sarah smiled, acknowledging the truth in her mother's words. She had learned to accept Ethan's wealth as part of their shared life without letting it define her or their relationship. The prenuptial agreement they had signed before their hasty wedding had been replaced 6 months later with a more thoughtful document that protected the company while ensuring Sarah's independence and security. "Speaking of things that don't seem real," Sarah said, lowering her voice, "I have news. I was waiting for the right moment to tell Ethan, but I wanted you to know first." Margaret's eyes widened in understanding. "Sarah, are you—" Sarah nodded, unable to contain her smile. 8 weeks, the doctor confirmed it yesterday." Margaret clasped her daughter's hands, tears of joy filling her eyes. "A baby! Oh, Sarah, that's wonderful news. We've been hoping, but with everything being so busy with the foundation launch." Sarah glanced across the room to where Ethan was deep in conversation with a hospital administrator. "I think he'll be thrilled." "More than thrilled," Margaret assured her. "He'll be over the moon. That man adores you, Sarah. A child will only make your bond stronger." Later that night, after the last guest had departed and they had returned to the Thompson estate, Sarah led Ethan to the garden room, the place where they had been married, where they had weathered crises, where they had planned their future together. "I have something for you," she said, handing him a small wrapped package. Ethan looked surprised. "What's the occasion?" "Open it and see," Sarah prompted, her heart racing with anticipation. He unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a small box. Inside was a tiny pair of baby booties and a note that read simply, "Coming in 7 months." Ethan stared at the contents for a long moment, then looked up at Sarah with wonder in his eyes. "We're having a baby." Sarah nodded, happiness bubbling up inside her at his expression. "We're having a baby." Ethan gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, I don't even have words." "I know," she replied, resting her head against his chest. "It's another miracle in a year full of them." They stood together in the moonlit garden room, contemplating this new chapter in their journey. From strangers connected by chance in a hospital room, to allies against betrayal, to husband and wife, and now to future parents, their path had been anything but conventional. "Do you ever think about how unlikely all of this is?" Ethan asked, his hand gently resting on her still flat stomach. "If I hadn't had that accident, if you hadn't been assigned to my room, if you hadn't decided to read to me during your breaks." "I try not to think about those what-ifs," Sarah admitted. "They're too frightening. But I'm grateful every day for whatever twist of fate brought us together. Not just fate," Ethan corrected gently. "Your choices, your compassion. You chose to see me as a person when I was just an unconscious body in a hospital bed. You chose to stand up for me when you discovered Alexander's plans. You chose to stay even when it would have been easier to leave." Sarah smiled up at him. "And you chose to trust me, to believe in me when others were trying to turn you against me. We both made choices that led us here." The next morning, they shared their news with Margaret over breakfast in the sunny kitchen. Her joy was immediate and effusive, launching into plans for a nursery garden visible from the baby's window. "Have you thought about names?" Margaret asked eagerly. Sarah and Ethan exchanged amused glances. "Mom, we just found out yesterday," Sarah laughed. "We haven't had time to think about names yet." "Well, there's plenty of time," Margaret conceded. "But it's never too early to start planning the garden. Babies can see colors from a very young." age, you know. Bright flowers would be stimulating for development. As Margaret happily sketched garden plans, Sarah's phone rang. It was Dr. Morgan. "Sarah, I hope I'm not calling too early," he began. "But I wanted to tell you what an impression the foundation made last night. My colleagues are already talking about how to implement the companionship program at other hospitals." "That's wonderful news," Sarah replied warmly. "We're hoping it will spread nationally within a few years." "I also wanted to share something else," Dr. Morgan continued. "A patient situation that reminded me of Ethan. We have a young woman, car accident victim, been in a coma for 3 weeks. Her prognosis is good, but she has no family locally. I was wondering if your patient companion program might be able to help. Someone to sit with her, read to her, provide that human connection we know is so important." "Absolutely," Sarah said without hesitation. "In fact, I'd like to visit her myself, if that's all right. When are visiting hours?" After arranging to visit the patient that afternoon, Sarah hung up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The foundation wasn't just an abstract charity, it was already making a tangible difference for real patients. "Going back to where it all began?" Ethan asked, having overheard her conversation. Sarah nodded. "A coma patient without family nearby. It feels right somehow to be the one to sit with her, to read to her." "Full circle," Ethan observed with a smile. "From hospital cleaner to foundation director, still making time to read to patients who can't respond. Some things shouldn't change no matter what else does," Sarah said simply. That afternoon, Sarah entered St. Luke's Hospital through the main entrance rather than the staff door she had used for years. The difference wasn't lost on her, nor was the respectful greeting from the front desk staff who once would have barely noticed her passing in her cleaning uniform. Dr. Morgan met her on the neurological floor, leading her to a private room where a young woman lay still and silent, connected to monitors much like Ethan had been. "This is Jessica Martinez," he explained. 24 years old, nursing student, ironically enough. She was on her way to a clinical rotation when another driver ran a red light. Sarah felt an immediate connection to the young woman, not just because of her profession, but because of the vulnerability she represented. "Does she have family?" "Parents in Arizona. They visited but couldn't stay indefinitely. They called daily for updates." Sarah approached the bed, studying Jessica's peaceful face. "Hello, Jessica," she said softly. "My name is Sarah. I'm going to sit with you for a while, if that's all right." Dr. Morgan smiled approvingly. "I'll leave you two alone. The nurses know you're authorized to stay as long as you like." After he left, Sarah settled into the chair beside Jessica's bed, the same position she had taken so many times beside Ethan. From her bag, she pulled out a book. "I brought something to read, to you," she explained to Jessica. "It's called The Little Prince. Someone very special once told me it was his favorite part of waking up, hearing me read this story when he was in a coma. I thought you might enjoy it too." As Sarah began to read, her mind briefly flashed back to the first time she had done this for Ethan, a simple act of kindness that had changed both their lives immeasurably. Now she was in a position to ensure that other patients received the same care, the same human connection that could make all the difference in their recovery. Hours later, when Ethan came to pick her up, he found Sarah still reading, one hand gently holding Jessica's as if to anchor her to the world outside her unconscious state. "How is she?" he asked quietly from the doorway. Sarah looked up with a soft smile. "Peaceful. The nurses say her vital signs have been more stable this afternoon. Just like mine were when you read to me," Ethan remembered. "They could never explain why my readings improved during your shifts. The science is catching up to what we instinctively know," Sarah said, carefully marking her place in the book. "Human connection matters maybe even more than we realize." As they prepared to leave, Sarah promised Jessica she would return tomorrow. Outside the hospital, the spring evening was mild and fragrant with blossoming trees. Ethan took Sarah's hand as they walked to their car. "Happy?" he asked simply. Sarah considered the question, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the pain and struggles, the triumphs and joys, the incredible twist of fate that had connected their lives. "Yes," she answered with absolute certainty, "completely happy." And she was. Despite the unconventional path, despite the obstacles they had overcome, Sarah had found something most people spend their lives searching for: purpose, love, and the chance to make a genuine difference in the world. As they drove home to the Thompson estate, where Margaret would be waiting to share dinner and continue planning for the baby's arrival, Sarah reflected on the power of second chances. Ethan had been given a second chance at life after his accident. She had been given a second chance at her dreams after years of sacrifice. Together, they were creating second chances for countless others through their foundation. The road ahead would have its own challenges, as all lives do. But Sarah knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The cleaning lady and the billionaire who had found in each other exactly what they needed most. Someone who saw beyond surface appearances to the heart. Beneath, someone who believed in second chances and the power of compassion to change lives. As the Thompson estate came into view, its windows glowing with welcoming light against the gathering dusk, Sarah felt a profound sense of homecoming. Not just to the physical place, but to the life she and Ethan had built together. A life neither could have imagined separately, but which had become more beautiful and meaningful than either could have dreamed. In hospital room 507, their story had begun with a simple act of kindness. Now that single act had rippled outward, touching countless lives through their foundation, their work, and the legacy they would pass on to their child. Some might call it fate or destiny. Others might see only an unlikely coincidence. But Sarah and Ethan Thompson knew the truth, that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin in the most ordinary circumstances, and that second chances, when embraced with courage and faith, can transform not just two lives but the world around them.